October 31st, 1887. The cold wind that rolled across the open prairie carried more than dust and winter chill. It carried the crackle of a brand new county trying to decide where its heart would beat. Gray County had only recently been organized, and now its first county seat election was supposed to settle the question. When the ballots were counted and the returns were canvassed, Cimarron was declared the temporary seat of government. The geography of Gray County was a harsh, unrelenting landscape of short-grass prairie where the Arkansas River flowed as a shallow, muddy vein through the earth. In 1887, the land was being carved into homesteads by men who had spent their life savings on a team of horses and a plow. Cimarron sat on the northern bank of the river, its streets laid out in a rigid grid of dirt and manure. The buildings were mostly constructed of pine boards shipped in from the east, and the paint was already peeling under the intense sun and abrasive dust. The town boasted a brick bank, several general stores, and a collection of saloons that served as the primary meeting places for the local partisans. When the proclamation arrived, the citizens of Cimarron felt a sense of permanent victory. They believed that once the county records were safely housed within their limits, no power in the state could move them. This belief led to an immediate atmosphere of arrogance that rankled the farmers who lived closer to the western edge of the county. Asa T. Soule was the primary reason the people of Ingalls believed they could challenge the established order of Cimarron. Soule was a millionaire from New York who had made his fortune selling hop bitters, a patent medicine consisting of alcohol and herbs that he marketed as a cure for every known ailment. He had invested over $1 million in the region, focusing his capital on the construction of the Eureka Irrigating Canal. This massive ditch was intended to divert water from the Arkansas River to thousands of acres of dry land, and Soule needed Ingalls to be the county seat to ensure his political and economic control over the water rights. He was a man who used money as a blunt instrument, and he began funneling thousands of dollars into the Ingalls Town Company. He purchased the loyalty of local leaders and began a massive construction project, erecting a large hotel and a bank to prove that Ingalls was the more modern and capable community. To Soule, the county seat was a commodity to be bought, just like the grain and cattle that moved through the rail yards. The immediate aftermath of the governor's announcement saw Cimarron officials attempting to solidify their power by appointing local men to every available government position. They selected T.H. Reeve as the temporary county clerk, a man whose primary qualification was his unwavering hatred for the Ingalls faction. These newly minted officials moved into a 2-story frame, building that would serve as the temporary courthouse. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of cigar smoke and the ink used to record land deeds. They worked by the light of kerosene lamps, their shadows stretching long across the wooden floors as they hurried to process as much paperwork as possible. They knew that as long as they held the county seal and the official ledgers, they held the legal authority of Gray County. They placed armed guards at the doors, men with calloused hands and steady eyes who watched the horizon for any sign of a raiding party from the west. In Ingalls, the mood was one of calculated resentment. The town was smaller, with fewer than 200 permanent residents, but it had the backing of Soule's immense wealth and a growing number of hired hands who worked on the irrigation canal. These laborers were often rough men who had drifted into Kansas looking for work and were more than willing to use force if the pay was right. The leaders of Ingalls, including men like N.B. Klain and George Binkley, began holding secret meetings in the back of the local land office. They drafted letters of protest to the governor, claiming that the Cimarron faction had used fraudulent signatures on the initial petition for county organization. They accused the Cimarron men of being thieves and bullies who intended to tax the rest of the county into poverty. This rhetoric was published in the Ingalls Messenger, a newspaper that functioned as a mouthpiece for Soule's interests, and it fanned the flames of anger among the western settlers. The brutality of the situation began to manifest in the daily interactions between the residents of the two towns. When a Cimarron merchant traveled west to deliver supplies to a homestead, he was often met with silence or open hostility. In the saloons, arguments over the county seat frequently ended in physical violence. One such encounter occurred in early November when a group of Ingalls canal workers entered a Cimarron tavern. A dispute over a game of cards quickly turned into a brawl involving 20 men. The sound of breaking glass and the thud of fists against flesh filled the small room. One man was thrown through a front window, his face sliced by the jagged glass, leaving a trail of dark blood on the dry soil outside. The Cimarron marshal had to use the butt of his Winchester rifle to restore order, cracking the ribs of 2 men before the crowd dispersed. These were not minor disagreements. They were the first physical expressions of a deep-seated tribalism that was consuming the county. The historical context of the 1880s in Kansas was defined by these seat wars, as the state legislature had created a system that almost guaranteed conflict. The law required a temporary seat to be named by the governor, followed by a permanent election within a year. This interim period was a lawless vacuum where the competing towns could use any means necessary to gain an advantage. The sheer scale of the corruption was staggering, with both sides regularly engaging in voter intimidation and the creation of ghost voters from the names found on cemetery headstones. In Gray County, the stakes were elevated because of the sheer amount of capital Asa Sol was willing to burn. He understood that the first town to hold a permanent election would likely win, as they would control the polling places and the counting of the ballots. He began a campaign of bribery, offering $500 to any man who could bring 10 pro-Ingalls voters to the polls. The physical environment of the frontier added to the tension, as the approach of winter brought freezing temperatures and biting winds that swept across the plains at 40 miles per hour. The men tasked with guarding the Cimarron courthouse sat in unheated rooms, wrapped in wool blankets that were infested with lice. They watched the road that connected the two towns, a narrow strip of dirt that was often obscured by swirling dust or snow. The isolation of the plains meant that no help would come from the state militia or federal marshals in time to prevent a slaughter. These men felt like they were on an island, surrounded by a vast sea of grass and a growing number of enemies. The sound of a horse galloping in the distance was enough to send the guards into a state of high alert, their fingers resting on the triggers of their shotguns as they peered through the gaps in the window shutters. The technological advantages of the era were exploited by both sides to gain an edge. Cimarron held the telegraph office, which allowed them to monitor messages going to and from Topeka. They frequently intercepted communications between Sol and his lawyers, using the information to anticipate legal moves. Ingalls, however, had the advantage of Sol's private railway cars and his influence with the Santa Fe executives. He could move men and supplies into Ingalls under the cover of night, bypassing the Cimarron station entirely. This logistical superiority allowed Ingalls to build its infrastructure at an incredible rate. Within a month of the governor's proclamation, Sol had funded the construction of a large 2-story stone building that he intended to be the permanent courthouse. The sight of the stone walls rising on the horizon was a constant source of irritation for the people of Cimarron, who saw it as a physical manifestation of Sol's intent to steal their status. The sheer brute force of the rivalry was evident in the way the towns began to militarize. By mid-November, almost every able-bodied man in the county was a member of an informal militia. They spent their evenings drilling in the streets, practicing the rapid deployment of their weapons and the fortification of key buildings. In Cimarron, the residents reinforced the courthouse with thick oak planks and moved the county records into a heavy iron safe that required 4 men to lift. They also stockpiled hundreds of rounds of ammunition and several crates of dynamite, which they stored in the cellar. The intent was clear: They would blow the building to pieces before they allowed the Ingalls faction to take the records. The grit of the situation was found in the grim faces of the fathers and husbands who were now preparing for a siege instead of tending to their winter crops. The financial scale of the conflict was also unprecedented for a county with such a small population. The legal fees for the various injunctions and lawsuits filed in the first month alone exceeded $3,000. This was at a time when a skilled laborer earned less than $2 a day. The money was being drained from the pockets of the settlers and the coffers of the town companies to pay for lawyers in Topeka and hired guards from Dodge City. This economic drain only increased the desperation of the populace. If their town lost the seat war, the citizens would be left with nothing but debt and a worthless plot of land. The pursuit of the county seat became a zero-sum game where the winner would achieve prosperity and the loser would face complete financial ruin. The brutality of the language used in the local press reflected the violent intentions of the people. The Cimarron Jacksonian published an editorial calling Asa Soul a vulture who feeds on the carcasses of honest men, while the Ingalls paper described the Cimarron leaders as a pack of rabid dogs who should be put down for the safety of the public. These insults were not taken lightly on the frontier, where a man's reputation was his most valuable asset. The editors of these papers often walked the streets with pistols tucked into their waistbands, expecting a physical confrontation at any moment. The printed word was used as a weapon to dehumanize the opposition, making it easier for the settlers to contemplate the idea of killing their neighbors over a collection of tax receipts and land titles. The specific injury details of the early skirmishes highlighted the lack of medical care in the region. When a man was injured in a street fight, his wounds were often treated with nothing more than raw whiskey and dirty bandages. A farmer who supported Ingalls was caught in Cimarron after dark, and was beaten so severely that his left eye was swollen shut and 3 of his teeth were knocked out onto the frozen ground. He had to crawl for 2 miles before he was found by a passing wagon. The lack of a local hospital meant that such injuries often resulted in permanent disfigurement or infection. The physical toll of the war was beginning to mount, and the residents were becoming accustomed to the sight of bruised faces and limping men. The historical context of 1887 also included the presence of legendary frontier figures who were drawn to the conflict. Men who had served as lawmen in Dodge City, such as Jim Masterson and Bill Tillman, began to take an interest in the Gray County dispute. Some were hired by Soul to provide protection for Ingalls, while others were recruited by Cimarron to bolster their defenses. The presence of these professional gunmen changed the nature of the conflict. It was no longer just a dispute between farmers and merchants. It was becoming a professional standoff between men who were experienced in the mechanics of violence. They brought with them a sense of lethargic menace, spending their days sitting on the porches of the saloons, their eyes never leaving the street. As the month of November progressed, the social fabric of the county continued to unravel. Families were split apart by their loyalties, with brothers refusing to speak to one another because they lived on opposite sides of the imaginary line that divided the town's interests. The local churches, which should have been places of peace, became battlegrounds for political influence. Preachers were forced to take sides, and those who called for moderation were often replaced by more militant voices. The children in the schoolhouses played a game they called seat war, which involved 2 groups of boys throwing stones and dirt at each other to capture a wooden box. The violence was being baked into the next generation, ensuring that the hatred would persist long after the official election was over. The scale of the corruption in the voter registration process was one of the biggest feats of the Ingalls faction during this initial period. They managed to register nearly 800 voters in a precinct that had only 300 residents. They did this by counting every traveler who stopped at the hotel for a single night, and every laborer who spent a week digging the canal. When the Cimarron officials challenged these numbers, the Ingalls leaders simply laughed and filed a countersuit. They felt untouchable because of Seoul's wealth and their connections in Topeka. This blatant disregard for the law made the Cimarron faction even more determined to hold onto the records by force. They realized that they could not win a legal battle against a man with $1 million, so they prepared for a physical one. The physical sensation of living in Cimarron during this time was one of constant, grinding paranoia. Every stranger who entered town was followed and questioned. The sound of the railroad whistle, which used to be a sign of progress, was now a source of anxiety, as it could mean the arrival of more hired gunmen for the Ingalls side. The residents began to sleep in shifts, with at least one member of every household staying awake to watch the front door. The grit of the dirt that blew into every crack of their houses seemed to symbolize the way the conflict was permeating every aspect of their lives. There was no escape from the war for the county seat. It was in the water they drank and the air they breathed. In Ingalls, the atmosphere was one of frantic, expensive growth. Seoul's money was being spent on more than just guards and lawyers. He was also building a massive stone bridge across the Arkansas River to link Ingalls to the southern part of the county. He wanted to make it as easy as possible for his supporters to reach the town on election day. The construction site was a hive of activity, with steam-powered cranes and dozens of horse-drawn wagons moving tons of rock and timber. The technological advantage of having a bridge would be significant, as it would allow Ingalls to control the flow of traffic and communication from the south. The Cimarron men watched this progress with a mixture of fear and envy, realizing that their natural advantage as the older town was being eroded by Seoul's capital. The brutality of the environment was matched by the brutality of the men who were now in control of the county's destiny. These were not the idealistic pioneers of popular fiction, but hard-edged opportunists and desperate laborers who saw the seat war as a way to secure their future. They had little regard for the democratic process or the sanctity of human life. They were willing to burn down a neighbor's barn or shoot a man in the back if it meant their town would win the courthouse. The historical reality of the Old West was often one of petty greed and systemic violence, and Gray County in late 1887 was a prime example of this reality. By the final week of November, the two towns were effectively two separate countries at war. Trade between them had completely ceased, and any resident of one town found in the other was subject to immediate arrest or physical assault. The county government was in a state of total paralysis, as the Cimarron commissioners refused to recognize any legal filings from the West, and the Ingalls leaders refused to pay any taxes to the Cimarron office. The state government in Topeka was beginning to receive frantic reports of the situation, but the governor was hesitant to intervene, fearing that sending in the militia would only escalate the violence. He hoped that the permanent election would resolve the issue, but he failed to realize that neither side would accept an unfavorable result. The specific numbers that defined the conflict at this point included a documented inventory of over 500 rifles and 50,000 rounds of ammunition that had been shipped into the county since the governor's proclamation. This was enough firepower to equip a small army, and it was all in the hands of untrained and angry civilians. The cost of living in the county had also skyrocketed, as the focus on the seat war had led to a shortage of basic supplies like flour and salt. Merchants in both towns were price gouging, knowing that the residents had nowhere else to go. The sheer relentlessness of the rivalry was starting to grind the populace down, yet no one was willing to be the first to suggest a truce. The role of the railroad became even more critical as the winter deepened. The Santa Fe tracks were the only reliable way to transport goods when the trails were buried in snow. Cimarron controlled the water tank that the locomotives needed to refill their boilers, and they used this as leverage, threatening to cut off the water to any train that carried Ingalls supporters. In retaliation, the Ingalls faction used their influence to ensure that express trains did not stop at Cimarron, depriving the town of mail and fresh supplies. This technological tug-of-war added another layer of complexity to the conflict, as both sides sought to use the infrastructure of the industrial age to settle a dispute that felt increasingly primitive and tribal. The brutality of the situation was also reflected in the treatment of the livestock. In their zeal to guard the courthouse or attend rallies, many farmers neglected their cattle, leaving them to huddle against the wire fences as the temperatures dropped below zero. The sound of the wind was often punctuated by the lowing of hungry animals, a haunting background noise to the hushed conversations of the armed men in the towns. The focus on the political struggle had blinded the people to the basic requirements of their survival on the plains. They were so focused on winning the future that they were destroying their present. The historical context of 1887 Kansas was also one of a collapsing cattle boom and the rise of a fragile agricultural economy. The people of Gray County were desperate for any source of stability, and they viewed the county seat as a guaranteed economic engine. They were fighting for the right to be the place where the lawyers, judges, and clerks spent their money. They were fighting for the right to be the center of the world, even if that world was only a few hundred square miles of dust. This desperation made them dangerous, as men with nothing to lose are the most likely to resort to extreme violence. As the month ended, a heavy silence fell over the county. It was not a silence of peace, but a silence of preparation. The initial shock of the governor's proclamation had worn off, replaced by a cold, hard determination to win at any cost. The lines were drawn, the weapons were loaded, and the leaders of both factions had committed themselves to a course of action that could only end in blood. The Cimarron County seat war had moved past the stage of political maneuvering and into the stage of active combat preparation. The stage was set for the legal and physical blockades of 1888. The sheer scale of the fight was solidified in the minds of the people. They were no longer just residents of a county. They were soldiers in a war. The number of armed men patrolling the streets of Cimarron had grown to nearly 100, and a similar number were on constant watch in Ingalls. The cost of this mobilization was being felt in every household, as the men were no longer working their land or running their businesses. The economic suicide of the county was well underway, fueled by the belief that the eventual victory would make all the sacrifices worth it. The final days of 1887 were a study in the grit and brutality of the frontier. Men with frostbitten fingers gripped the cold metal of their rifles, their eyes red from lack of sleep and the constant sting of the wind. They lived in a world where the law was a distant theory, and the only reality was the man standing across the street with a gun. The rivalry over the county seat had become a totalizing force, stripping away the thin veneer of civilization that the settlers had tried to bring to the plains. The war was no longer about a courthouse. It was about who would survive to see the spring. The Cimarron faction held the records, but the Ingalls faction held the money and the momentum. This balance of power was unstable and could not last. Every day that the records remained in Cimarron was a victory for the incumbents, and every day that Sol spent his money was a step toward a confrontation. The people of Gray County were waiting for a spark, something that would turn the simmering resentment into an all-out conflagration. They did not have to wait long, as the coming year would bring the first attempts to move the records by force, and the first major injuries that would prove how far these rivals were willing to go. The chapter of the paper spark ended with the realization that the governor's pen had been more dangerous than any rifle. It had created a division that could not be healed by words or votes. The high plains of Kansas were ready to soak up the blood of the men who fought for the right to call themselves the county seat. The story of Gray County was just beginning, and the grit and brutality of the frontier were about to be displayed in a way that the state of Kansas would never forget. January 25th, 1888. The sun rose as a pale, heatless disk over the frozen expanse of the high plains, illuminating the frantic activity surrounding the two-story frame building in Cimarron. Men with heavy coats and wool scarves wrapped tight around their faces hauled thick sheets of scrap iron from the Santa Fe rail yards toward the structure. The ground was frozen solid, making every step a risk of a twisted ankle or a fall onto the razor-sharp ice crystals. These men were not construction workers. They were storekeepers, blacksmiths, and laborers who had transformed into a defensive militia overnight. They carried hammers, heavy bolts, and hand-cranked drills, intending to turn the temporary courthouse into a fortress that no raiding party could breach. The air was so cold that the metal of the iron plates stuck to their bare skin if they touched it without gloves, ripping away small patches of flesh that bled and then froze instantly. The physical labor involved in fortifying the building was a grueling testament to the town's desperation. The laborers used heavy oak timbers, 6 inches thick and 10 feet long, to reinforce the interior of the ground floor walls. They drove iron spikes into the wood with rhythmic, echoing thuds that could be heard on the outskirts of the settlement. Every window on the lower level was covered with a combination of these timbers and thin strips of steel salvaged from broken plow blades. The intent was to create a barrier that would stop a rifle projectile fired from the street while allowing the defenders inside to return fire through narrow horizontal slits. The smell of sawdust mingled with the metallic tang of cold iron and the sour scent of unwashed bodies as 40 men crammed into the tight spaces to complete the work before nightfall. The iron shutters were the most formidable part of the new defense. These were custom-made by the local blacksmith, who had worked for 48 hours straight, without sleep, to forge the hinges and latches. Each shutter weighed 60 pounds and required 2 men to lift into place. Once bolted to the exterior window frames, they provided a solid layer of protection against the Winchester rifles and Colt revolvers favored by the Ingalls faction. The men inside the building tested the latches, feeling the heavy click of iron meeting iron, a sound that provided more comfort than any legal document or court order. They knew that the law was currently a secondary concern to the physical possession of the county records, which sat in a heavy iron safe in the center of the main room. The guards' equipment was meticulously organized and kept within arm's reach at all times. They carried double-barreled shotguns loaded with buckshot and repeating rifles with 14-round magazines. Every man had a leather belt cinched tight around his waist, bulging with dozens of brass cartridges. They did not use the common term for the metal projectiles, referring to them only as slugs or shells as they counted their inventory. There were 3,000 rounds of ammunition stored in the building, stacked in wooden crates near the interior walls. The guards spent their downtime cleaning the actions of their weapons, using oily rags to wipe away the grit and soot that accumulated in the dry Kansas air. The sound of cycling bolts and clicking hammers was a constant background noise inside the iron perimeter. The smell of the town of Cimarron had changed since the fortification began. The usual scents of cooking fires and horse manure were now overshadowed by the smell of coal smoke and the sharp, ozone-like odor of hot metal. A communal kitchen had been established in the back of the general store to feed the guards, where large pots of black coffee and greasy salt pork simmered on a wood-burning stove. The men ate in shifts, standing up with their rifles leaned against their shoulders, their eyes never leaving the windows. They consumed their food with a mechanical efficiency, their minds focused on the potential for an attack. The local women brought in pails of water and loaves of hard bread, their faces etched with the same grim determination as the men. The legal tension had reached a point where the judicial system was effectively bypassed by physical force. The Cimarron faction ignored the latest injunction from the district court, viewing it as a piece of paper that held no weight against their iron shutters. They believed that as long as they controlled the physical building, they controlled the county's destiny. The commissioners met in the upper room of the courthouse, their voices hushed as they discussed the costs of the defense. They had already spent $400 on the iron and wood, a sum that represented a significant portion of the town's remaining treasury. They knew that if they could hold out through the winter, the Ingalls side might run out of the capital needed to maintain their own mercenary forces. The height and weight of the barricades made the courthouse a looming, ugly presence in the center of the town. It no longer looked like a place of government, but resembled a blockhouse from a frontier war. The perimeter extended beyond the building itself, as the men dug shallow trenches in the frozen dirt and strung several rows of heavy-gauge barbed wire across the road. This wire was designed to snag the legs of horses and slow down any mounted charge. The laborers who strung the wire had their hands shredded by the metal barbs, the cold making the skin brittle and easy to tear. They wrapped their bloody fingers in strips of burlap and continued to work, driven by the belief that any weakness would be exploited by the Ingalls raiders. The lack of medical help in the area meant that every minor injury during the construction was a potential crisis. A man named Thomas Miller had his foot crushed when a sheet of iron slipped from a wagon, the heavy metal, snapping the small bones in his instep with a sickening crack. Without a doctor present, his comrades pulled off his boot, revealing a purple, swollen mass of flesh and bone. They poured raw whiskey over the injury and wrapped it tight with a clean shirt, but Miller was forced to leave the line of defense. His absence was felt by the other men, who realized that a single bullet or a falling timber could remove them from the fight just as easily. The brutality of the environment was a constant reminder of their vulnerability. The Ingalls observers were frequently seen on the horizon, sitting motionless on their horses just out of rifle range. They watched the progress of the fortifications through brass spyglasses, noting the placement of every new iron plate and barbed wire fence. These scouts were often men who had been hired from the surrounding counties, individuals with no personal stake in the war. But a high degree of professional interest in the town's defenses. They rode back and forth along the ridgeline, their silhouettes stark against the gray winter sky. The Cimarron guards watched them back, their fingers itching for the triggers of their long-range Sharps rifles. But they held their fire, knowing that the first shot would trigger a full-scale battle. The cost of the iron plates was a burden that every citizen of Cimarron felt in their daily lives. The local merchants had donated their entire stocks of hardware and construction materials, receiving nothing but promises of future repayment once the county seat was secured. This meant that simple items like nails, hinges, and bolts were no longer available for the general public. If a man's barn door broke or his plow needed repair, he had to wait or find a way to fix it with rawhide and scrap wood. The town was cannibalizing itself to protect the courthouse, a process that created a sense of shared sacrifice and communal anger. Every man who stood watch felt that he was defending his own property as much as the public records. The wood used for the perimeter was primarily green pine, which was prone to warping and shrinking as it dried in the cold air. This meant that the guards had to constantly inspect the barricades for gaps or loose boards. They used hand saws to trim the edges and added extra layers of bracing wherever the wood showed signs of splitting. The physical act of maintenance was a never-ending task that kept the men occupied during the long, boring hours of the day watch. They spoke in short, clipped sentences, their conversation limited to the technical details of the defense. The social niceties of town life had been stripped away, replaced by the functional language of a military garrison. The iron safe inside the building was a massive black-painted box that stood 5 feet tall and weighed nearly 2 tons. It was positioned on a reinforced section of the floor directly over one of the heavy oak support beams. The county records, the poll books, the land deeds, and the tax ledgers were kept inside this safe, behind a door that was 4 inches thick. The key was held by the county clerk, who slept in the room with the safe, his hand resting on the holster of his revolver. To the people of Cimarron, this safe was the heart of the county. If it were taken, the town would cease to exist in any official capacity. They viewed the iron perimeter as the ribs and skin that protected this vital organ. The guards' mental state was a volatile mix of boredom and high-alert paranoia. They were constantly scanning the horizon for a dust cloud or a flicker of movement that shouldn't be there. The lack of sleep was beginning to take a toll on their judgment, with some men claiming to see ghostly riders in the swirling snow. They drank pot after pot of bitter coffee to stay awake, the caffeine making their nerves jumpy and their tempers short. Brawls occasionally broke out over minor slights or perceived lapses in duty, but these were quickly suppressed by the leaders of the militia. They knew that internal division was the only thing that could defeat them as long as the iron plates held. The lanterns and lighting inside the fortified building were kept to a minimum to avoid giving the Ingalls snipers a clear target through the firing slits. At night, the rooms were illuminated only by the dim, flickering glow of a few shielded oil lamps. The shadows were deep and long, hiding the faces of the men and making the interior feel like a cave. The guards sat on crates of ammunition, their silhouettes cast against the iron-clad walls. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whistling of the wind through the cracks in the siding and the occasional groan of the building as it settled in the cold. Every man was a shadow among shadows, waiting for the sound of a hoofbeat or a whispered command. The frostbite and physical injuries became more common as the temperature dropped to 5 degrees below zero on the night of the 25th. The men on the exterior guard posts had to be rotated every 30 minutes to prevent them from freezing to death. Their boots were stuffed with straw for insulation, but the cold still seeped through the leather, turning their toes numb and white. Many of the men developed painful chilblains on their fingers and ears, the skin turning red and itchy before blistering. They treated these injuries with tallow or axle grease, the only lubricants available. The physical suffering was a constant grinding reality that tested their resolve more than any threat of violence. The weapons details were a point of pride for the Cimarron men. They had several heavy-caliber buffalo guns capable of hitting a target at 500 yards, which they stationed in the upper-story windows. These rifles were mounted on sandbags to provide a stable platform for the shooters. The men selected for these posts were the best marksmen in the county, individuals who had spent their lives hunting antelope and protecting their livestock from coyotes. They kept their rifles clean and well-oiled, ensuring that the firing pins would not freeze in the extreme cold. The sight of these long barrels protruding from the firing slits served as a warning to any Ingalls scout who ventured too close. The lack of sleep among the leadership was particularly severe. The commissioners and the marshal had not had a full night's rest in over a week. They spent their nights reviewing maps and coordinate reports, trying to predict the path of a potential raid. They knew that the Ingalls faction had hired professional gunmen from Dodge City, men who were experts in the art of the surprise attack. The Cimarron leaders countered this by establishing a network of outposts 3 miles beyond the town limits, where riders would light signal fires if they spotted a large body of men approaching. This early warning system was their only defense against a nighttime incursion. The food situation remained, focused on high-calorie, easily prepared meals that could be eaten with one hand. The diet of salt pork, beans, and hard bread was supplemented by the occasional haunch of venison brought in by the local hunters. The men developed a thick layer of grime on their skin and clothes, as there was no water available for washing and no time to spare for hygiene. The interior of the courthouse smelled like a stable, a combination of old sweat, wet wool, and wood smoke. This physical filth was a badge of honor for the guards, a sign that they were fully committed to the defense of their town. The railroad's role in the conflict was a constant source of anxiety for the Cimarron faction. While the Santa Fe tracks ran through the center of town, providing them with supplies, they knew that the same tracks could be used to transport a large force of mercenaries from the east or west. They placed guards at the water tank and the depot, with orders to inspect every car of the passing freight trains. They also kept a supply of heavy chains and locks ready to secure the switches, preventing any unauthorized train from entering the sidings. The technological power of the locomotive was a double-edged sword that could either save the town or bring about its destruction. The wind and weather continued to be the most persistent enemies of the men in the iron perimeter. The Kansas wind was a relentless force that pushed through every gap in the fortifications, bringing with it a fine, abrasive dust that coated everything in a layer of gray grit. The men had to wrap their faces in bandanas to breathe, and the dust got into the actions of their rifles, requiring constant cleaning. The weather was a physical weight that pressed down on them, draining their energy and making every movement a struggle. They lived in a world of gray and brown, where the only color was the dull gleam of the iron plates and the orange flicker of the lamps. The iron bars on the windows were reinforced, with cross braces of steel, making it impossible for anyone to climb inside, even if they managed to breach the shutters. These bars were hammered into the stone foundation and the heavy timbers of the frame, creating a structural cage around the ground floor. The men inside felt a sense of claustrophobia, but they preferred the feeling of being trapped to the feeling of being exposed. They knew that the Ingalls side had access to dynamite, and they worried about the possibility of a sapper attempting to blow a hole in the wall. To counter this, they placed buckets of loose dirt and water throughout the building to smother any fuses or fires. The drilling of the militia took place in the small courtyard behind the courthouse, out of sight of the Ingalls scouts. The men practiced moving from one firing slit to another, reloading their weapons in the dark and communicating without shouting. They used hand signals to indicate the direction and distance of a target. The discipline of the group was surprisingly high for a civilian force, driven by the knowledge that their lives depended on their ability to work together. The marshal, a man who had seen service in the Civil War, oversaw the training, his voice a low, gravelly bark that demanded absolute obedience. The horses and transportation of the Cimarron faction were kept in a livery stable adjacent to the courthouse, where they were protected by a separate detail of armed guards. These animals were their only means of communication with the outlying settlements and the only way to pursue a retreating enemy. The horses were kept saddled and bridled at all times, with their coats covered in heavy blankets to keep them from freezing. The men knew that if the courthouse was surrounded, they would need the horses to break the siege or send for help. The animals were as much a part of the defense as the iron plates and the rifles. The specific layout of the perimeter was designed to create a series of kill zones where any attacker would be caught in a crossfire. The barbed wire was angled to funnel intruders toward the front of the building, where the concentration of riflemen was highest. The men had also cleared away all the brush and small outbuildings within 100 yards of the courthouse, leaving a flat, open space that offered no cover for a raiding party. Every inch of the ground was mapped and assigned to a specific guard. They had practiced firing at wooden targets placed at various distances, ensuring that they knew exactly where to aim in the low light of dawn or dusk. The psychological pressure of the standoff was beginning to affect the families of the men inside the building. Wives and children lived in a state of constant fear, knowing that their husbands and fathers were in the direct line of fire. The social life of the town had completely stopped, with the school closed and the church services held in private homes. The atmosphere in Cimarron was one of a town waiting for a disaster to happen. The people spoke in whispers, and the sound of a door slamming was enough to make everyone jump. The iron perimeter had not only fortified the courthouse but had also walled off the hearts of the residents. The darkness and night watch were the most dangerous times for the Cimarron militia. They worked in three-man teams, with one man sleeping, one man watching the horizon, and one man patrolling the interior of the building. They used a system of passwords and countersigns to identify each other in the dark, a necessary precaution given the risk of infiltration. The silence of the night was heavy and oppressive, making the slightest sound seem like a major threat. The guards strained their ears to hear the sound of a muffled hoofbeat or the clink of metal against stone. They lived in a world of shadows, where every movement was a potential death sentence. The soundscape of the construction had been replaced by a tense, vibrating silence. The hammers and saws were quiet now as the primary work was complete. The only sounds were the breathing of the men, the rustle of their clothes, and the occasional hiss of a lantern. This silence was more taxing than the noise had been, as it allowed the men's imaginations to run wild. They thought about the mercenaries in Ingalls, imagining them cleaning their weapons and planning their attack. The silence was a physical pressure that made their ears ring and their hearts race. They waited for the first shot, almost wishing for it to happen just to break the tension. The resolve of the townspeople was solidified by the sight of the completed fortress. They saw the iron plates and the heavy timbers as a physical manifestation of their right to exist. They believed that no force on the plains could take the county records as long as they remained inside those walls. This conviction gave them the strength to endure the cold, the hunger, and the fear. They were no longer just a collection of settlers. They were a community bound together by iron and blood. They had committed themselves to a path of violence, and they were prepared to follow it to the end, regardless of the cost. The completion of the fortress on the evening of the 25th was marked by a grim, silent toast of lukewarm coffee among the guards. They stood in the center of the main room, surrounded by the iron safe and the crates of ammunition, their faces illuminated by a single lamp. They did not celebrate, as they knew the real test was yet to come. They checked the latches on the iron shutters one last time and settled in for the night watch. The iron perimeter was now a reality, a hard, cold barrier between the people of Cimarron and the ambitions of their rivals. The high plains were silent, frozen in the grip of a winter that showed no sign of ending. The state of the county was now one of frozen, armed neutrality. The Cimarron faction had built their wall, and now they were waiting for the Ingalls faction to try and tear it down. The struggle had moved beyond the realm of words and legal filings, entering a phase of physical endurance and brutal determination. The iron plates on the courthouse windows were a symbol of the new reality in Gray County, a world where the only law was the one that could be enforced by a man with a gun behind a sheet of steel. The people were ready for the next move, their eyes fixed on the western horizon where the lights of Ingalls flickered in the dark. July 4th, 1888. The sun emerged over the horizon at 5 o'clock in the morning as a searing crimson eye that promised a day of physical misery and extreme thermal intensity for the residents of the high plains. In Cimarron, the expectation of a celebratory Independence Day was replaced by a rigid tactical preparation for a confrontation with the rivals from the west. The dirt of the main thoroughfare was parched and cracked, having seen no moisture for 3 consecutive weeks, and the wind began to stir the topsoil into fine gray plumes by 6 o'clock. Men did not dress in their Sunday finest for the occasion, but instead wore heavy denim trousers and sweat-stained cotton shirts that offered little protection from the ultraviolet rays. They checked the actions of their revolvers and wiped the grit from the brass casings of their ammunition, knowing that the holiday provided the perfect cover for an incursion by the Ingalls faction. The heat reached 104 degrees by noon, creating a physical environment that was nearly as lethal as the weaponry being brandished. Every breath taken by the men standing watch in the shadows of the wooden storefronts felt like inhaling the exhaust of a steam locomotive. The moisture on their skin evaporated instantly, leaving behind a white crust of salt that stung their eyes and irritated the raw patches of skin on their necks. There was no shade to be found in the center of the street, where the light reflected off the pale soil with a brilliance that caused temporary blindness for those not squinting through the dust. The dogs of the town retreated beneath the raised boardwalks, their tongues lolling in the stagnant air as they sought any relief from the oppressive solar weight. At exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the rhythmic thumping of a train engine signaled the arrival of the Ingalls contingent. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe locomotive pulled 4 passenger cars into the Cimarron station, the iron wheels screeching against the rails as the brakes were applied. From these cars descended 162 men, a mixture of local Ingalls residents and hired enforcers who had been paid $5 each to make their presence felt. They did not carry flags or banners of celebration. They carried repeating rifles and double-barreled shotguns. Their boots struck the wooden platform with a coordinated violence that echoed through the quiet town, and they immediately formed a column 4 men wide. The Ingalls men moved with a deliberate slowness toward the center of Cimarron, their spurs jingling with every step on the uneven planks of the boardwalk. They were led by local organizers who had spent the previous night drinking and planning this display of brute force. The men in the column were covered in a layer of soot and coal dust from the train ride, making their faces look like dark masks with white staring eyes. Many of them carried large wooden containers that were supposed to hold picnic supplies but actually contained extra rounds of ammunition and several gallons of whiskey. The smell of the group preceded them, a thick odor of stale tobacco, unwashed wool, and the metallic scent of oiled steel. The Cimarron militia, numbering approximately 140 men, stepped out from the alleys and doorways to meet the newcomers. They formed a horizontal line across the street 20 yards from the front of the Ingalls column. The space between the two groups became a zone where the heat shimmered and the dust swirled in erratic patterns. There were no words exchanged at first, only the sound of 200 hammers being pulled back to the half-cock position. The tension was a physical pressure that seemed to push against the chests of everyone present, making it difficult to draw a full breath. The residents of Cimarron who were not involved in the militia peered through the gaps in their boarded-up windows, their hands trembling as they watched the standoff develop. The Ingalls faction brought with them several examples of modern repeating technology, specifically the Winchester Model 1873 and 1886 rifles. These weapons allowed a single man to fire 15 rounds without reloading, a significant advantage over the older single-shot rifles held by some of the poorer Cimarron farmers. The sun glinted off the steel barrels and the polished wooden stocks, creating a visual display of lethality that was intended to break the resolve of the defenders. In response, the Cimarron men gripped their 12-gauge shotguns tighter, the heavy barrels loaded with buckshot that would shred anything within 30 yards. The mechanical advantage of the Ingalls repeaters was balanced by the raw, short-range destructive power of the Cimarron scatterguns. As the confrontation stretched into its second hour, the physical toll of the heat began to cause casualties. A man in the Ingalls front rank, an older settler named Jacob Vance, suddenly collapsed onto the hot dirt, his face turning a deep shade of purple. He went down without a sound, his rifle clattering against a stone. No one from the Cimarron side moved to help, and his own comrades were hesitant to break formation to assist him. He lay there in the dust, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps as the sun beat down on his prone body. 2 other men eventually dragged him by his armpits into the thin sliver of shade provided by the railroad depot, his heels dragging 2 parallel lines in the gray soil. The brutality of the situation was found in the total lack of empathy between the two groups. These were men who had traded at the same mills and sat in the same cattle auctions only 2 years prior. But now they looked at each other with a predatory focus. The pupils of their eyes were constricted to tiny black dots in the glare, and their faces were frozen in masks of grim hostility. Every time a man on either side shifted his weight or reached for a canteen, 50 rifles would track the movement with a synchronized, mechanical precision. The sound of a horse neighing in a nearby stable was enough to cause several men to flinch, their fingers tightening on their triggers until their knuckles turned white. Alcohol began to play a role in the instability of the standoff as the afternoon progressed. The Ingalls men had been passing around quart jars of unaged whiskey, and the combination of high-proof spirits and extreme heat was making them erratic. Their speech became loud and slurred, and they began to shout insults at the Cimarron line. They called the Cimarron men cowards and thieves, mocking their attempts to fortify the courthouse. One man from Ingalls, visibly intoxicated, stumbled forward 3 steps and spat a glob of brown tobacco juice toward the feet of the Cimarron marshal. The marshal did not move, but the man behind him leveled a shotgun at the intruder's chest, the twin muzzles looking like black tunnels to the drunkard. The civilian population of Cimarron was trapped in a state of terror. Women and children were huddled in the cellars of their homes. The air inside these underground spaces thick with the smell of damp earth and rot. They could hear the shuffling of boots and the occasional shouted oath from the street above. A young girl in a house near the station was struck in the hand by a splinter of wood when an Ingalls man accidentally discharged his revolver into the boardwalk. The small metal slug tore through the pine plank and sent a jagged piece of wood into her palm, causing a deep laceration that bled profusely onto her white dress. Her mother muffled the girl's screams with a rag, fearing that any loud noise would trigger a general massacre. The logistical scale of the event was massive for such a sparsely populated area. Over 300 armed men were concentrated in a single city block, representing nearly half of the adult male population of the entire county. The financial cost of this day was also significant, as the railroad had been paid a premium to run the special train, and the Ingalls Town Company was footing the bill for the whiskey and the ammunition. Asa Sol had provided an additional $2,000 in cash to be distributed among the participants if they successfully intimidated the Cimarron commissioners into surrendering the records. The money was a primary motivator for many of the hired hands, who viewed the seat war as a lucrative break from the hard labor of the canal project. The environmental conditions continued to deteriorate as a dust storm began to gather on the western horizon. A wall of brown grit, 500 feet high, was moving slowly across the prairie toward the town. The air became even more stagnant and heavy, and the sky took on an eerie yellow-brown hue. The wind began to pick up, carrying the scent of dry rain and electricity. The men in the street, watched the approaching storm with a mixture of dread and anticipation, knowing that the loss of visibility would either end the standoff or provide the cover needed for a bloody assault. The grit began to sting their faces, and they pulled their bandanas up over their noses, looking like a collection of masked bandits. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the physical exhaustion of the participants was nearly absolute. Many of the men had been standing in the sun for 4 hours without water, and their muscles were beginning to cramp. Their legs shook from the strain of remaining upright, and their vision was starting to blur at the edges. Despite the physical agony, the relentlessness of their rivalry kept them in place. To retreat would be to admit defeat and lose the economic future of their town. They were locked in a struggle of wills that was being fought with their bodies as much as their weapons. The grit in their teeth and the salt in their eyes were the physical reality of their political convictions. A small scuffle broke out on the northern end of the line when a Cimarron man tried to push past an Ingalls guard to reach a well. The two men collided, their sweat-slicked bodies grappling in the dirt. They traded short, brutal punches to the ribs and face, the sound of bone hitting flesh audible in the sudden silence of the crowd. The Ingalls man used the butt of his rifle to strike the Cimarron resident in the temple, opening a 3-inch gash that poured blood down the side of the man's face. The injured man fell to his knees, clutching his head, and was quickly pulled back into the Cimarron line. The incident nearly sparked a volley of gunfire, but the leaders on both sides shouted for restraint, realizing that a fight would result in the deaths of dozens of men within seconds. The technology of communication was also present in the form of the telegraph operator in the station. He sat at his desk, his fingers rapidly tapping out updates to the governor's office in Topeka. He described the standoff in cold, clinical terms, noting the number of men and the types of weapons being used. The wires hummed with the news of the impending violence, but the distance to the state capital was too great for any immediate intervention. The operator could hear the Ingalls men shouting outside his window, and he kept a loaded Remington Derringer on the table next to his key. He was a neutral party in theory, but he knew that if the shooting started, the station would be one of the first targets. The sheer scale of the weaponry involved was staggering. If every man in the street fired just once, over 300 slugs would be flying through a space no larger than a kitchen. The brick walls of the nearby bank were pitted with small craters from previous skirmishes, and the wooden siding of the hotels was riddled with holes. The men were aware of the lethality of their environment, and they stood with their backs to whatever cover they could find. Barrels of flour, hitching posts, and the wheels of freight wagons. The grit of the situation was found in the way they used these mundane objects as breastworks for a war that had no front lines. The brutality of the sun reached its peak at 5 o'clock, just as the dust storm reached the edge of town. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a matter of minutes as the sun was obscured by the brown cloud. The wind roared through the streets, tearing hats from heads and knocking over signs. The visibility dropped to less than 10 feet, and the men were forced to huddle together to avoid losing sight of their enemies. In the chaos of the wind and dust, several shots were fired into the air, the flashes of the muzzles visible for a split second in the gloom. The sound was muffled by the wind, but it sent a shockwave of panic through the ranks. Men scrambled for cover, their boots slipping on the dry soil. The Ingalls leaders, realizing that the dust storm had ruined their chance for a coordinated display of force, began to order their men back toward the train station. They moved in a disorganized mass, their bodies buffeted by the wind and their eyes stinging from the sand. The Cimarron militia did not pursue them, instead retreating toward the courthouse to ensure that the records were still secure. The physical departure of the Ingalls faction was not a victory for Cimarron, but rather a temporary reprieve granted by the weather. The men reached the station platform, their faces caked in a thick mud formed by the mixture of sweat and dust. The injuries from the day were numerous, though most were not caused by bullets. Over 20 men on both sides suffered from varying degrees of sunstroke, and several others had skin that was literally blistered by the solar radiation. The physical toll included the man with the head wound, the girl with the hand injury, and dozens of individuals with strained muscles and dehydration. The Ingalls men boarded the train, their movements heavy and sluggish. They left behind the man who had collapsed earlier. He had died in the shadows of the depot, his heart failing under the strain of the heat and the tension. His body was covered with a piece of burlap and left for the Cimarron marshal to handle. The train departed Cimarron at 6 o'clock in the evening, the engine laboring against the wind as it headed west. The iron wheels ground against the sand-covered tracks, creating a shower of sparks that was visible in the twilight. The men inside the cars sat in a stunned silence, the adrenaline of the standoff replaced by a crushing fatigue. They had achieved nothing but a display of presence, and the cost had been the life of one of their own and the total exhaustion of their strength. The rivalry had proven that both sides were willing to endure extreme physical suffering to maintain their position. But it had also shown that neither side was yet ready to initiate a massacre. In Cimarron, the militia stayed on guard throughout the night, despite the ending of the dust storm and the cooling of the air. They sat in the dark courthouse, their bodies aching and their minds clouded by the events of the day. They did not speak of the dead man at the depot or the girl in the cellar. They spoke only of the next time the Ingalls men would return. The holiday had been a grim rehearsal for a much more violent performance. The grit of the dust was in their lungs and the taste of the salt was on their lips, a permanent reminder of the day they stood in the sun to defend a collection of paper ledgers. The specific numbers of the day were recorded in the marshal's log: 1 death by natural causes, 2 serious injuries, 1 civilian casualty, and over 4,000 rounds of ammunition accounted for among the Cimarron defenders alone. These figures solidified the scale of the confrontation in the minds of the local government. They realized that they were no longer dealing with a political dispute but a military occupation. The town of Cimarron was effectively a fortress, and the surrounding prairie was a battlefield. The brute force of the Ingalls faction had been met with a relentless defensive posture, and the result was a stalemate of pure exhaustion. The technology of the railroad had allowed for the rapid mobilization and withdrawal of the Ingalls force, but it had also made them vulnerable to the environmental conditions of the plains. If the train had been delayed or if the tracks had been sabotaged, the 160 men would have been stranded in a hostile town without supplies. This logistical reality was not lost on the Cimarron leaders, who began to discuss ways to disable the tracks to prevent future incursions. The use of industrial tools to fight a territorial war was becoming the standard operating procedure for both factions. The brutality of the frontier was displayed not in a grand battle, but in the slow, grinding endurance of the men in the street. It was the grit of the dust in a man's eyes and the stinging of a sunburnt neck. It was the sight of a neighbor leveling a rifle at a friend. The day was one of fear, thirst, and a primitive loyalty to a piece of ground. The holiday of 1888 would be remembered not for the celebration of a nation, but for the display of a local hatred that was more powerful than the heat of the Kansas sun. The financial impact of the day was felt by the local businesses, which had lost a full day of trade and had their buildings damaged by the crowds and the dust. The cost of the repairs to the boardwalks and the replacement of the broken windows would fall on the individual owners, further draining the resources of the town. This economic pressure was a deliberate part of the Ingalls strategy. They wanted to make it so expensive for Cimarron to exist that the residents would eventually give up and move west. The war was being fought in the ledgers of the general stores as much as it was in the streets. The physical sensation of the evening was one of a heavy, damp cold that replaced the intense heat of the day. A light rain began to fall around 9 o'clock, turning the dust into a slick gray mud that covered everything. The men of Cimarron walked through this sludge as they patrolled the perimeter, their boots making a wet, sucking sound with every step. The rain did not wash away the tension. It only added a new layer of physical discomfort to their lives. They were wet, cold, and exhausted, but they remained at their posts, their rifles kept dry beneath their coats. The scale of the rivalry was now clear to everyone in the state. The newspapers in Topeka and Kansas City carried accounts of the Cimarron standoff, describing it as a powder keg that was waiting for a spark. The governor was pressured to send in the state militia, but he remained hesitant, hoping that the legal process would eventually provide a solution. He did not understand the sheer relentlessness of the men in the county. They were not interested in legal solutions. They were interested in winning. The right to be the county seat was a prize that justified any amount of suffering or violence in their eyes. The darkness of the night of July 4th was absolute, as the thick clouds obscured the moon and stars. The only light in Cimarron came from the occasional flicker of a guard's lantern or the glow of a cigar. The town was silent, but it was the silence of a predator waiting in the grass. The people knew that the Ingalls faction would return, and next time they might not wait for the sun to go down. The holiday ended with the town in a state of siege, its citizens weary but unyielding. The final tally of the day's events showed that the Ingalls faction had successfully demonstrated their ability to project power into the heart of their rivals' territory. They had proven that they could move a large armed force with precision and that they had the financial backing to sustain such operations. Cimarron had proven that they could not be intimidated and that they were willing to turn their town into a battlefield to protect the records. The lines of the conflict were now drawn in the blood of the man who died at the station and the sweat of the men who stood in the street. The brutality of the situation was solidified by the realization that there was no way back to a peaceful coexistence. The men who stood across from each other on July 4th would never again trust one another. The social contract of the county had been shredded by the wind and burnt by the sun. The future was no longer a question of who had the better town, but who had the more durable will and the more effective weapons. The holiday standoff was the final moment of hesitation before the war entered its most lethal phase, December 10th, 1888. The atmosphere inside the second-story suite of the Wright House Hotel in Dodge City was thick with the gray haze of cigar smoke and the sharp, fermented odor of rye whiskey. Outside the window, a relentless northern wind pushed fine grains of ice against the glass panes, creating a rhythmic scratching sound that underscored the tension in the room. Asa Soul sat at the head of a heavy mahogany table, his expensive wool coat buttoned to his chin despite the heat from the pot-bellied stove in the corner. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a gold watch, noting the time was exactly 9:30 in the evening. Across from him sat several men whose faces were etched with the deep lines of life on the edge of the law. They did not speak of civic duty or the future of the plains. They focused entirely on the leather-bound ledger and the stacks of gold coins arranged in the center of the table. Jim Masterson leaned forward into the circle of lamplight, his eyes reflecting the flickering orange flame of the kerosene wick. He was a man of medium height but possessed a broad, powerful frame that made the wooden chair creak under his weight. His skin was the color of cured leather, weathered by decades of Kansas sun and winter gales. Masterson had served as the marshal of Dodge City during its most violent years, and his reputation for cold, calculated efficiency with a firearm was well known across the territory. He picked up a .45 caliber revolver from the table, checking the cylinder with a series of mechanical clicks that sounded like a clock being wound. For the sum of $1,000 in gold, he agreed to organize a strike force to travel to Cimarron and extract the county records by any means necessary. Standing near the door, Bill Tilghman watched the proceedings with a detached, professional air. He was a legendary figure who had spent his life as a hunter, scout, and lawman, possessing a level of skill with a Winchester rifle that few could match. Tilghman was known for his calm demeanor even in the most lethal situations, a trait that Masterson valued above all else for the upcoming operation. He had already recruited 6 other men, including Ben Daniels and Neil Brown, who had served as deputies in some of the roughest cow towns in the West. These men were not residents of the county and felt no loyalty to either Cimarron or Ingalls. They viewed the conflict as a business arrangement, a way to earn a substantial bonus for a single night of work. The equipment for the operation was laid out on a wool blanket on the floor for inspection. Each man was issued a new Winchester Model 1873 repeating rifle, the weapon of choice for its reliability and its 15-round magazine. They also carried several boxes of .44 .40 caliber cartridges, the brass casings gleaming in the dim light. The metal slugs were heavy and designed to expand upon impact, ensuring that, Any resistance met at the courthouse would be dealt with permanently. Masterson insisted that every man carry at least 200 rounds of ammunition on his person, stored in leather belts and bandoliers. The weight of the equipment was a constant physical presence, reminding the mercenaries of the lethal nature of their contract. The logistics of moving the iron safe out of Cimarron required more than just gunmen. Masterson had secured 2 heavy freight wagons, each equipped with reinforced axles and thick oak beds designed to support the 4,000-pound weight of the safe. These wagons were stationed at a livery stable on the edge of Dodge City, where the wheels were being fitted with extra iron bands to prevent them from shattering on the frozen ruts of the prairie roads. The teams of 4 horses each were selected for their strength and endurance, and they were currently being fed a high-protein diet of oats and corn to prepare them for the 60-mile round trip. Every horse was shod with specialized ice cleats to ensure they could maintain their footing on the treacherous, snow-covered inclines near the Arkansas River. The environmental conditions of December were a primary factor in the timing of the raid. The temperature in Dodge City had dropped to exactly -8 degrees, and the ground was frozen as hard as granite to a depth of 12 inches. Masterson believed that the Cimarron guards would be less alert during a severe winter storm, preferring to stay inside the courthouse near the stove rather than patrolling the perimeter. He planned to use the cover of the early morning hours, specifically the time before the sun rose, to strike when the human body is at its most sluggish and the will to fight is at its lowest. The cold was a physical barrier that worked in their favor, as the sound of their approach would be muffled by the thick layer of crusty snow covering the plains. The contract itself was a simple document written in a cramped, legalistic hand on Soul's private stationery. It specified that the mercenaries would receive $500 each upon the successful delivery of the iron safe and the county seal to the bank in Ingalls. Any expenses incurred, including the cost of ammunition, horse feed, and medical supplies, would be covered by the Ingalls Town Company. Soul also included a provision for a $200 bonus for any man who was injured in the line of duty. The men signed their names with a flourish, their calloused hands gripping the pen with the same firmness they used on the handles of their revolvers. The clinking of the gold coins as Masterson distributed the initial retainers was the only sound in the room for several minutes. Asa Soul's motivation for hiring the mercenaries was purely financial. He had invested over $1 million in the Eureka Irrigating Canal, a project that depended entirely on his ability to control the local government. Without the county seat in Ingalls, he could not guarantee the water rights or the tax exemptions he needed to make the canal profitable. To him, the residents of Cimarron were not neighbors but obstacles to his progress. He viewed the use of professional gunmen as a regrettable but necessary step in the development of the region. He told Masterson that he did not care how many men were killed in the process, as long as the records were in his possession by the end of January. The role of the railroad was essential to the success of the plan. Soul used his influence with the executives of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe to secure a private locomotive and a single passenger car for the transport of the men and horses. This allowed them to travel from Dodge City to Cimarron in less than 3 hours, bypassing the regular schedule and avoiding the eyes of any Cimarron spies. The train was currently waiting in the rail yards, its boiler kept warm by a trusted engineer who had also been paid a substantial bribe. The technological advantage of the steam engine meant that the mercenaries could strike with a speed and force that the local Cimarron militia could not hope to match. The training for the raid took place in a secluded sand pit 5 miles south of Dodge City. For 3 days, the men practiced drawing their revolvers and firing at wooden targets shaped like human torsos. The sound of the repeated volleys echoed off the frozen walls of the pit, a sharp cracking noise that could be heard for miles. Masterson emphasized the importance of center-mass shots and the need to maintain a continuous rate of fire to prevent the Cimarron guards from organizing a counterattack. They also practiced the mechanical process of reloading their Winchesters in the dark, using only their sense of touch to guide the cartridges into the loading gates. The smell of gun oil and burnt powder permeated their clothes, a scent that would remain with them until the operation was complete. The tools for the safe's extraction were meticulously prepared and packed into wooden crates. These included 4-foot iron pry bars, heavy-duty hemp ropes with a tensile strength of 5,000 pounds, and a set of block and tackle pulleys. They also brought along a 10-pound sledgehammer and a series of cold steel chisels, in case the locks on the safe proved resistant to the keys they hoped to seize from the county clerk. These tools were heavy and awkward to handle, requiring 2 men to lift the crates into the freight wagons. The physical effort required to move the iron safe was as much a part of the planning as the gunfight itself, as every minute spent inside the courthouse was a minute of extreme vulnerability. The scouts who had been monitoring the Cimarron courthouse provided Masterson with a detailed map of the defenses. They noted that the iron shutters were only on the ground floor, and that the second-story windows were protected only by wooden slats. The trenches dug into the frozen dirt were approximately 3 feet deep and 4 feet wide, designed to stop a wagon from reaching the building. Masterson planned to overcome this by using the railroad platform as a staging area, and then moving the safe across the open ground between the station and the courthouse. He knew that the Cimarron defenders were numerous, but he also knew they lacked the discipline of his professional unit. He intended to exploit their fear and lack of coordination during the first few minutes of the assault. The physical toll of the preparation was evident in the men's appearance. Their faces were chapped and raw from the biting wind, and their lips were cracked and bleeding. Several men showed signs of early frostbite on their ears, the skin turning a sickly, waxy white. They treated these injuries with a mixture of lard and camphor, the thick grease providing a layer of protection against the elements. Their hands were rough and calloused from handling the cold metal of their weapons and the coarse fibers of the hemp ropes. Despite the physical suffering, the men remained focused on the objective, driven by the promise of the gold waiting for them in Ingalls. They moved with a stiff, deliberate gait, their muscles aching from the constant drills. The psychological state of the group was one of quiet, cold-blooded resolution. There was no joking or boasting among the mercenaries. They understood the lethality of the task ahead. They spent their evenings in the boarding house in total silence, cleaning their weapons and checking the tension on the springs of their magazine tubes. They did not interact with the locals in Dodge City, keeping to themselves to prevent any leakage of information. The air in their quarters was stagnant and smelled of unwashed wool and gun oil. Each man knew that he was putting his life on the line for a paycheck, and he accepted that reality with the stoicism of a professional killer. The horses were treated with more care than the men themselves. Masterson knew that the animals were the only way to move the heavy safe once it was removed from the courthouse. The 4 teams of draft horses were kept in a heated stable and groomed twice a day to maintain their circulation. They were shod with heavy iron shoes that featured sharpened steel points or ice cleats, which allowed them to dig into the frozen ground and pull with maximum force. The horses were the mechanical heart of the extraction process, and their health was a top priority for the success of the mission. The smell of fresh hay and manure in the stable was a sharp contrast to the biting cold of the winter air. Asa Sol also used his wealth to bribe local officials in Dodge City, ensuring that no law enforcement officers would interfere with the assembly of the mercenary force. He paid $500 to the county sheriff and several hundred more to the city marshal to ensure their cooperation. This legal cover was a crucial part of the strategy. It allowed Masterson to move his men and equipment through the streets without fear of arrest. The corruption of the local government was a direct reflection of the power of Seoul's capital. To him, the law was a flexible tool that could be bent or broken to serve his interests. The specific count of ammunition was finalized at exactly 12,000 rounds. This included 9,000 rifle cartridges and 3,000 revolver rounds, packed into 60 wooden crates. The weight of the ammunition alone was over 500 pounds, and it was distributed among the wagons and the railroad car. Masterson believed in overwhelming firepower as the best way to end a conflict quickly. He did not want to get into a prolonged siege. He wanted to strike hard, seize the records, and disappear before the rest of the county could react. The sheer volume of metal he planned to bring to Cimarron was intended to intimidate the defenders into a rapid surrender. The weather forecast for the middle of January predicted a major blizzard, with snowfall expected to exceed 10 inches and winds gusting up to 40 miles per hour. Masterson viewed this as the perfect opportunity. He knew that such a storm would ground the local riders and make communication between Cimarron and the surrounding farms nearly impossible. He intended to use the whiteout conditions to hide the movement of his wagons and to mask the sound of the train. The blizzard was a double-edged sword that could either hide their approach or trap them in a frozen wasteland, but it was a risk that Masterson was more than willing to take. He studied the barometric readings with the same intensity he used on his maps. The hierarchy of the group was strictly enforced, with Jim Masterson having the final word on all tactical decisions. Bill Tilghman acted as his second-in-command, responsible for the oversight of the other gunmen. Ben Daniels was tasked with managing the logistics of the wagons and the horses, while Neil Brown was in charge of the ammunition and the tools. This organized structure was what set the mercenaries apart from the disorganized mob of the Cimarron militia. Each man knew his role and was expected to execute it without question. The discipline of the group was the primary reason Seoul had been willing to pay such a high price for their services. The social isolation of the mercenaries was a deliberate choice to maintain operational security. They lived in a small boarding house on the edge of the railroad tracks, away from the saloons and the gambling halls of the town center. They ate their meals in silence, focusing on the high-calorie diet of beef, potatoes, and bread they needed to sustain themselves in the cold. The lack of interaction with the outside world created a sense of tribal loyalty among the men. They began to view themselves as a single unit, a weapon that was being sharpened for a specific purpose. The tension in the house was a physical weight, a feeling of impending violence that never left them. Every evening, the men spent at least 2 hours disassembling and reassembling their Winchesters. They used a fine grade of whale oil to lubricate the firing pins and the extractor claws, ensuring that the cold would not cause the mechanisms to jam. They also checked the alignment of the sights and the tension on the trigger pulls. The mechanical action of the rifles was a source of comfort to the men, a sound of reliability in an uncertain situation. They treated their weapons with a reverence that bordered on the religious, knowing that their lives depended on the performance of the steel and wood in their hands. The clicking of the levers and the snapping of the hammers was the background music of their nights. The plan for the arrival in Cimarron was detailed down to the minute. The train would pull into the station at precisely 4:40 in the morning, under the cover of the deepest darkness. The men would dismount and form 3 squads, 1 to secure the railroad platform, 1 to attack the front of the courthouse, and 1 to move the wagons into position at the rear exit. They had exactly 30 minutes to breach the building, secure the safe, and load it onto the primary wagon. Any delay beyond that time would risk the arrival of the town's population. Masterson knew that speed was the most important element of the raid, and he drilled the men on the timing until it was ingrained in their muscle memory. The iron safe in Cimarron was a formidable object, standing 5 feet tall and 4 feet wide, with walls made of 4-inch thick steel. It was anchored to the floorboards with heavy iron bolts, which the mercenaries would need to shear off using their cold chisels and sledgehammers. Masterson had studied a sketch of the safe's construction, noting the location of the hinges and the locking mechanism. He knew that the safe was fireproof but not burglar-proof, and he was confident that his men could extract it if given enough time. The safe was the physical manifestation of the county's legal existence, and its capture would be the ultimate victory for the Ingalls faction. The financial risk for Asa Sol was immense, as the failure of the raid would not only result in the loss of his investment, but would also likely lead to criminal charges. However, he was a man who had built his fortune on high-stakes gambles, and he viewed the county seat war as the most important gamble of his life. He spent his days in the Dodge City Bank reviewing his accounts and ensuring that the funds were available for the mercenaries' final payment. His desperation was palpable, showing in the way his hands shook as he turned the pages of his ledgers. He knew that he was on the verge of either total success or complete ruin, and the suspense was taking a toll on his health. The physical grit of the hotel room was a testament to the long nights of planning. The floor was covered in a layer of ash and discarded matches, and the mahogany table was stained with circles from the whiskey glasses. The air was heavy and stagnant, a combination of smoke, sweat, and the metallic scent of the coins. The men's clothes were dirty and stained with grease, and they had long since stopped caring about their personal hygiene. They were living in a world of pure function where the only thing that mattered was the successful completion of the mission. The grit was in the water they drank and the air they breathed, a constant reminder of the brutality of their environment. The contrast between the professional mercenaries and the Cimarron farmers was a primary theme of the planning. Masterson knew that the farmers would fight for their homes, but he also knew they were not prepared for the level of violence he was prepared to unleash. He intended to use the mercenaries' superior training and equipment to overwhelm the defenders before they could even realize what was happening. He did not view the Cimarron men as equals. He viewed them as targets to be eliminated. This cold-blooded detachment was what made the mercenaries so dangerous. They were not driven by passion or pride. They were driven by a contract. The final signing of the contract was a solemn moment, marked by a silent toast of the remaining rye whiskey. The men stood around the table, their faces illuminated by the dim light of the lamps, and drained their glasses in unison. They did not speak of the future or of the possibility of death. They spoke only of the gold. The clinking of the coins as they were placed in a leather pouch was the final confirmation of the deal. Masterson took the pouch and tucked it into his coat, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. The contract was now in effect, and the lives of every man in Gray County were about to be irrevocably changed. The departure of the mercenaries was a secret operation, carried out under the cover of night. The crates of ammunition and tools were loaded into the railroad car and labeled as agricultural machinery to avoid suspicion. The horses were walked up the wooden ramps and secured in the stalls, their breath forming thick clouds in the cold air. The men boarded the passenger car, their rifles held between their knees, and settled in for the short ride to Cimarron. The sound of the steam whistle was a low, mournful moan that echoed across the plains, a signal that the final phase of the war was beginning. The train pulled out of the station at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, moving slowly through the dark. The cold-blooded resolution of the men was the last thing visible as the train disappeared into the winter night. They sat in the dark car, their eyes fixed on the horizon, their minds focused on the courthouse and the safe. They were the humanized elements of a violent machine, a force of nature that was about to descend on the unsuspecting town of Cimarron. The path of no return had been crossed, and the blood of the coming confrontation was already on their hands. The grit of the Kansas winter was the setting for a tragedy of greed and local pride that would be remembered for generations. The final detail of the preparation was the agreement on the signal for retreat. If the raid failed or if the opposition proved too strong, Masterson would fire 3 rapid shots into the air to signal for the men to return to the train station. He hoped that the signal would not be necessary. But he was a realist who understood that even the best-laid plans could go wrong. He checked his watch one last time as the train gained speed, the golden casing glinting in the dark. The time for planning was over. The time for action had arrived. The high plains of Kansas waited in a frozen silence, ready for the sound of the Winchester rifles to break the night. January 12, 1889. The bone-deep chill on the Cimarron streets made every breath look like smoke and every footstep sound too loud. A lumber wagon creaked through the half-light toward the town's courthouse, its wheels crunching frozen dirt, its bed empty on the way in and hungry for county records on the way out. A dozen deputized men rode with it, hard-eyed and quiet, the kind of men the western towns were known for, including Jim Masterson, Bill Tillman, Ben Daniels, and Neil Brown. They had not come to argue, they had come with a court order and the muscle to enforce it, and they meant to haul Gray County's books and papers to Ingalls before Cimarron could rally. Upon reaching the courthouse, Jim Masterson did not hesitate or offer a summons for surrender. He swung the iron butt of his rifle into the doorframe, the dry pine splintering under the force of the blow. The lock sheared away from the wood, and the door swung open with a violent crash. Enforcers flooded the ground floor, their rifles leveled at the 4 guards who were just beginning to rise from their chairs. The suddenness of the intrusion left the defenders in a state of paralysis. The room was illuminated by the flickering orange light of the wood stove, which highlighted the grim, masked faces of the intruders. The smell of cold air and burnt coal entered the building, clashing with the scent of stale coffee and old tobacco. The first real resistance came in a heartbeat. J.W. English stepped into the doorway, reaching for a shotgun kept close for exactly this kind of morning, and the moment the raiders saw the barrel move, a rifle cracked. English went down hard in the dirt, and the sound of that single shot snapped the whole town awake. The iron safe stood in the center of the office, a black 2-ton monolith that contained every legal document produced since the county's inception. Bill Tillman and 3 other men threw heavy hemp ropes around the metal casing, cinching them tight with professional knots. They began to haul the safe toward the rear exit, the iron casters on the bottom of the box screaming as they carved deep, jagged furrows into the wooden floor. The physical strain was immense, and the men's breath came in ragged, steaming gasps. They managed to move the safe exactly 15 feet before the sounds of the struggle reached the ears of the townspeople living in the adjacent boarding houses. A local resident named Jack Bliss was the first to realize the courthouse was under siege. He stepped onto his porch and fired 3 shots from his revolver into the air, the reports echoing through the quiet town like thunderclaps. Within 3 minutes, the alarm had spread to every house in Cimarron. Men who had been sleeping in their clothes grabbed their rifles and ran into the street, their feet sliding on the ice. They took positions behind the stone walls of the bank and the heavy oak hitching posts of the general store. The first volley of return fire from the townspeople struck the wooden siding of the courthouse, the copper-jacketed projectiles punching through the thin boards and showering the intruders with splinters. The gunfight became a continuous, deafening roar as 30 Cimarron men opened fire on the building. The enforcers responded with their Winchesters, firing through the gaps in the iron shutters. The high-velocity slugs from the repeating rifles were far more lethal than the scattered fire of the citizens. One Cimarron man, attempting to cross the street to gain a better angle, was struck in the neck. The metal projectile severed his carotid artery, and he fell into the frozen dirt, his life's blood steaming in the sub-zero air before it turned into a solid, dark crust on the snow. His comrades could only watch from behind their cover, unable to move through the wall of metal being directed at them from the courthouse windows. By 5:30 in the morning, the number of Cimarron defenders had grown to 60 men. They utilized the brick walls of the nearby hardware store as a fortress, creating a crossfire that pinned the hired gunmen inside the courthouse. An enforcer named Ben Daniels was struck in the shoulder by a projectile that passed through a gap in the window shutter. The impact threw him against the iron safe, the bone in his upper arm pulverized into dozens of white fragments. He did not scream, but his face turned a waxy shade of gray as he slumped against the metal. His comrades continued to fire, their movements becoming more frantic as they realized their escape route was being cut off. The two freight wagons that had been waiting behind the courthouse attempted to move into position for the safe's extraction. The drivers lashed the four-horse teams into a gallop, the animals' hooves throwing up clods of frozen earth. As the first wagon drew level with the loading dock, a Cimarron man leveled a heavy-caliber buffalo rifle and fired. 50-caliber slug struck the lead horse in the center of its chest, the massive force of the impact killing the animal instantly. The horse collapsed in its harness, tripping the other three animals and causing the wagon to overturn with a sickening crunch of breaking wood and screaming livestock. The second wagon driver, seeing the carnage, wheeled his team around and fled toward the rail yard. The loss of the primary wagon meant the enforcers were now trapped with a 2-ton safe and no way to transport it. Masterson made the tactical decision to abandon the records and seek more defensible cover. He ordered his men to move toward the Bliss Building, a 2-story brick structure located 30 yards to the east. As they prepared to make the run, they gathered their wounded and checked their ammunition. They had expended over 800 rounds in the first hour of the fight. The air inside the courthouse was thick with the smell of cordite and the metallic tang of blood from the injured guards and gunmen. At exactly 6:15, the enforcers surged out of the rear exit, firing their Winchesters in every direction to suppress the Cimarron militia. They ran across the open ground, their boots slipping on the blood-slicked ice. A Cimarron man named C.A. Bliss fired a shotgun from a nearby alley, the buckshot striking one of the gunmen in the back of the legs. The man fell face forward into the dirt, his hamstrings shredded by the heavy metal pellets. His comrades grabbed him by his coat collar and dragged him the remaining 10 yards into the Bliss Building. They kicked the door shut and barred it with a heavy oak beam, their breathing coming in short, agonizing bursts. The interior of the Bliss Building provided the enforcers with the protection of thick masonry walls, but it also became a cage. The Cimarron townspeople quickly surrounded the structure, occupying the rooftops and windows of every surrounding building. They began to fire at the brickwork, the slugs chipping away pieces of red clay and limestone. The hired gunmen were forced to stay low on the floor, their rifles pointed at the doors and windows. Neil Brown was struck in the face by a shard of glass when a metal projectile shattered a second-story window. The glass sliced through his eyelid and cheek, causing blood to flow into his eye and blinding him on one side. He wiped the fluid away with a grimy sleeve and kept his thumb on the hammer of his revolver. The brutality of the injuries on the Cimarron side was equally severe. The local bank had been turned into a surgery center where the town barber and a veterinarian attempted to treat the wounded. One man had his hand nearly severed by a rifle slug, the bone crushed into a pulp. They used a bone saw to complete the amputation, the sound of the teeth against the bone audible over the distant crackle of the gunfight. They used raw rye whiskey as an anesthetic, pouring it into the man's open wounds and down his throat. The floor of the bank was covered in blood and discarded bandages, the scent of antiseptic and iron filling the cramped space. By 7 o'clock, the sun began to rise, casting a cold blue light over the town. The visibility improved, allowing the Cimarron sharpshooters to target the enforcers with greater precision. They noticed a gunman attempting to shift positions on the second floor and fired a coordinated volley. 3 slugs struck the man simultaneously, one in the hip, one in the ribs, and one in the jaw. The force of the projectiles threw him out of the window, his body striking the frozen ground with a dull thud. He lay there in the snow, his jaw hanging at a grotesque angle, his life fading into the sub-zero air. No one from either side attempted to retrieve the body. The Ingalls enforcers realized they were being abandoned by their own side. The team and wagon that had brought them to Cimarron still waited near the edge of town, but the driver, terrified by the scale of the mob, decided to bolt. He snapped the reins and sent the horses west toward Ingalls at exactly 7:45. The gunmen watched from the windows of the Bliss building as their only quick escape disappeared into the distance. This betrayal by their own transport drained the remaining morale of the group. They were now 12 men against an entire town, with no reinforcements and a dwindling supply of ammunition. The Cimarron marshal, seeking to prevent further loss of life among his own citizens, called for a ceasefire at 8 o'clock. He walked into the center of the street holding a white flour sack over his head. The shooting stopped, leaving a heavy, vibrating silence over the town. He shouted for Masterson to come to the window, stating that the townspeople were prepared to burn the Bliss building to the ground with everyone inside if the Dodge City men did not surrender. He pointed to several men who were currently stacking crates of kerosene and bundles of hay against the base of the brick walls. The threat of fire was a terrifying reality, as the interior of the building was filled with wooden furniture and dry floorboards. Masterson replied with a defiant shout, stating that they were holding the county clerk as a hostage and would kill him if the Cimarron militia made a single move toward the building with fire. He showed the clerk at the window, the man's face bruised and his hands bound with sharp baling wire. The wire had been cinched so tight that the clerk's fingers were a dark, sickly purple, the circulation completely cut off. The sight of their neighbor being treated with such brutality caused a roar of anger from the crowd, and several men had to be physically restrained from charging the front door. The standoff reached a point of absolute lethal equilibrium. The environmental conditions continued to punish the combatants. The wind speed increased to 20 miles per hour, driving the temperature even lower. The men on the barricades had been standing in the cold for over 4 hours, and many were suffering from early stages of frostbite. Their toes and fingers were numb and their skin had taken on a waxy white appearance. They took turns retreating to nearby kitchens to thaw their limbs. But the transition from the freezing street to the hot stoves caused agonizing pain as the blood began to flow back into the damaged tissues. Despite the physical suffering, not a single Cimarron man left the line. Inside the Bliss building, the enforcers were also freezing. They had no stove and were forced to huddle together on the floor for warmth. They chewed on hard biscuits and drank the last of their whiskey, the alcohol providing a temporary sense of heat that actually accelerated their physical decline. The gunman with the shattered shoulder was now drifting into a coma, his breathing a wet, rattling sound. The stench of unwashed bodies, cordite, and iron-rich blood was heavy in the enclosed space. They knew that as soon as the sun went down, the Cimarron men would use the darkness to breach the walls. The scale of the violence was quantified by the number of empty brass casings littering the streets. A young boy who was sent to gather ammunition for the defenders reported counting over 3,000 spent shells in the first block alone. This amount of metal represented a significant financial investment and a staggering level of lethal intent. The buildings in the center of Cimarron were no longer shops and hotels, but were now pockmarked ruins. The glass from the windows lay in sparkling piles on the boardwalks, and the wooden doors were riddled with holes the size of a man's thumb. The town had been transformed into a landscape of wreckage in a single morning. At 9 o'clock, a group of Cimarron men managed to bring a small brass mountain howitzer into the street. They had borrowed the piece of artillery from a neighboring county for just such an occasion. They positioned the cannon exactly, 40 yards from the front door of the Bliss building and began to load it with a mixture of rusty nails, scrap iron, and glass shards. The sight of the cannon being leveled at their position caused the enforcers to scramble to the rear of the building. While the cannon was small, the debris it would discharge would act like a massive shotgun blast, capable of shredding anyone in the main hallway. The use of such a weapon proved the town was willing to destroy the building and everyone in it to win. The marshal made one final offer of safe passage at 10 o'clock. He proposed that the hired gunmen surrender their weapons and be escorted to the county line by a neutral party. In exchange, they would release the hostage and provide a full confession of their involvement with Asa Sol. Masterson and Tilghman held a hurried discussion in the shadows of the second floor. They were professional gunmen, but they were also pragmatists. They knew they could not win a fight against a cannon and 300 angry farmers. They agreed to the terms, but only if they were allowed to keep their sidearms until they reached the railroad station. The marshal refused, demanding total disarmament. The tension of the negotiations was broken by a sudden discharge of a rifle from a Cimarron rooftop. The metal projectile struck the brickwork inches from Masterson's head, sending a shower of red dust into his hair. The hired gunmen immediately resumed firing, and the ceasefire collapsed into a new burst of violence. The sound was even more intense than before, as the defenders were now using every weapon they possessed. The howitzer was fired once, the blast of nails and iron bolts tearing through the wooden doors of the Bliss building and pulverizing the interior staircase. An enforcer standing near the top of the stairs was struck by a dozen pieces of scrap metal, his body riddled with holes before he tumbled into the debris below. The brutality of the howitzer blast ended the active resistance of the enforcers. The screams of the wounded man at the bottom of the stairs echoed through the building, a high, thin sound that broke the resolve of the remaining men. They realized that the Cimarron men were no longer interested in a surrender. They were interested in an execution. Masterson shouted for his men to drop their rifles and hold their hands up at the windows. He threw his own Winchester out into the snow as a sign of submission. One by one, the other Dodge City men followed suit, their weapons disappearing into the white drifts below. The Cimarron militia did not immediately charge the building. They remained behind their cover, their rifles still leveled at the windows. They waited for the marshal to confirm the surrender. The silence that followed the howitzer blast was heavy and expectant, broken only by the crackling of the small fire that had started in the debris of the staircase. The smell of burnt powder and wood smoke hung over the street like a fog. The people of Cimarron stood in the freezing cold, their faces grim and their hearts hard. They had defended their town, but the cost was visible in the bodies of their neighbors lying in the dirt. At exactly 10:30, the hired gunmen were ordered to walk out of the building one by one, with their hands on their heads. The first to emerge was Jim Masterson, his sheepskin coat covered in brick dust and blood. He was followed by Bill Tillman and the rest of the surviving enforcers. They were greeted by a wall of rifles and the silent, hateful stares of the townspeople. As they reached the center of the street, they were forced to their knees in the frozen mud. The Cimarron men surrounded them, their fingers on the triggers of their shotguns. The threat of a lynching was palpable, and the marshal had to step between the prisoners and the mob, his own revolver drawn to maintain order. The county clerk was released from the building, stumbling into the arms of his friends. He was in a state of deep shock, his wrists bleeding where the wire had cut into the bone. His hands were swollen to twice their normal size, and he had lost sensation in most of his fingers. He was carried to the bank infirmary, where the barber began the task of cleaning the wounds and attempting to restore circulation. The clerk's injuries were a physical manifestation of the brutality of the raid. He would carry the scars of the wire for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of the morning the gunman came to steal the safe. The final tally of the morning incursion showed one man dead, J.W. English, and several others wounded on both sides. The town was a landscape of wreckage, with the courthouse and the Bliss building bearing the brunt of the damage. The iron safe remained in the center of the courthouse, unmoved and unopened. The records were still in Cimarron possession, but the cost of that possession was a blood feud that would never be resolved. The financial damage to the town was estimated at $4,000, a sum that the town company could not afford to pay. As the prisoners were led away toward the jail, a heavy snow began to fall, covering the bloodstains and the shell casings in a layer of white. The temperature remained well below zero and the wind continued to howl across the plains. The men of Cimarron began the grim task of recovering the bodies of their neighbors and the dead horses. They worked in silence, their movements slow and heavy with exhaustion. They had won the battle, but the struggle for the county seat was far from over. They knew that Asa Sol would seek revenge for the defeat of his hired enforcers. The morning of January 12th ended with the town of Cimarron in a state of mourning and military occupation. Every entrance to the town was guarded by armed citizens, and a new detail was assigned to the iron safe. The people lived in a world of fear and grit, their lives defined by the struggle for a piece of ground and a collection of papers. The brutality of the morning had proven how far they were willing to go to win, but it had also shown the devastating price of that victory. The high plains of Kansas remained cold and indifferent to their suffering, a vast expanse of ice and wind that swallowed the echoes of the gunfire. January 12th, 1889. The brick walls of the Bliss building vibrated under the rhythmic impact of dozens of high-velocity rifle projectiles as the morning light revealed the lethal trap closing around the Dodge City gunman. Inside the structure, the air was a thick gray suspension of mortar dust, pulverized brick, and the acrid residue of burnt gunpowder. The temperature remained at 10 degrees below zero, causing the moisture from the men's breath to freeze onto their wool coat collars in stiff white crystals. Jim Masterson crouched near a window on the second floor, his fingers white and numb against the cold walnut stock of his Winchester. He watched the movement in the street below, where 300 Cimarron citizens had converted every hitching post and water trough into a firing position. The sound of the conflict was no longer a series of individual reports, but a continuous, vibrating roar that made speech impossible and forced the defenders to communicate through frantic gestures and shoveled movements. The physical state of the Bliss building was rapidly deteriorating under the sustained barrage of the Cimarron mob. Every window had been shattered into thousands of jagged shards that littered the floorboards, reflecting the cold morning sun in erratic flashes. The brickwork, though 4 inches thick, was being systematically chipped away by the concentrated fire, sending sharp fragments of red clay into the eyes and skin of the trapped enforcers. Bill Tillman occupied a corner of the main room, his face masked by a layer of fine red dust that mixed with the sweat on his brow to form a muddy paste. He worked the lever of his rifle with a mechanical, desperate speed, his shoulder bruised from the repetitive recoil of over 200 shots. The floor around him was buried deep under a carpet of spent brass casings that clicked and shifted whenever he moved his feet to gain a better vantage point. Inside the Bliss building, the first casualty among the raiders was Ed Brooks. He had been hit in the back and the legs in the opening exchange, and now he lay on the floorboards with his breath coming fast and shallow, blood spreading dark and sticky beneath him. At around 9:24, as the firing outside rose and fell like a storm, Brooks tried to drag himself into deeper cover. Another volley slapped the walls with dull thuds, and the men around him shoved him behind a desk, tearing cloth into makeshift bandages while keeping their rifles trained on the windows. Everywhere Brooks touched, he left a smear of red against the pale plaster. The smell of powder and blood mixed in the trapped air, and the room felt smaller with every minute, a box of splintered wood and rising panic. The Cimarron mob responded to the perceived increase in interior violence with a surge of brute force. They began to use a heavy 10-foot length of railroad iron as a battering ram, suspended by thick chains from a horse-drawn dray. They moved the improvised engine toward the front doors of the Bliss building, shielded by a wall of hay bales stacked on a flatbed wagon. The sound of the iron striking the door was a deep, resonant boom that shook the building to its limestone foundation. Inside, the enforcers felt the floorboards vibrate and saw the mortar rain down from the ceiling joists. The physical reality of the siege was a grinding, unrelenting pressure that sought to crush the structure and everyone within it. Masterson ordered 3 men to the ground floor to reinforce the doors with heavy crates of hardware and lengths of scrap timber. The environment inside the fortress was a landscape of sensory overload and physical decay. The smell of the dead horse in the street drifted in through the broken windows, a cloying metallic scent that mixed with the odor of unwashed men and hot gun barrels. The enforcers' vision was blurred by the lack of sleep and the constant sting of the mortar dust. They had no water, and their throats were raw from the smoke and the sub-zero air. One of the mercenaries, Neil Brown, had been struck in the arm by a spent bullet that had ricocheted off a brick. The projectile had not penetrated the skin but had caused a massive purple hematoma that made his arm nearly useless. He continued to load magazines for the others with his one good hand, his teeth clenched against the throbbing pain that pulsed with every heartbeat. The crossfire reached a peak of intensity at 10 o'clock in the morning, with over 400 shots being fired into the building in a single 10-minute window. The slugs punched through the thin wooden office partitions inside, creating a maze of lethal trajectories. The enforcers were forced to lie flat on the floor, their faces pressed against the cold wood, as the air above them was filled with a whistling, metallic storm. They could hear the townspeople shouting insults and promises of hanging, the voices rising and falling with the rhythm of the wind. The brutality of the situation was found in the total absence of any legal or social constraint. The town had become a primitive arena where the only rule was the survival of the strongest. The technology of the era was displayed in the variety of weapons being used by the Cimarron citizens. While the enforcers had standardized Winchesters, the mob used a collection of old Springfield muskets, Sharp's buffalo rifles, and various double-barreled shotguns. This diversity meant that the incoming fire consisted of a wide range of calibers and weights, from small pistol slugs to massive 50-caliber projectiles that could pass through a brick and still kill a man on the other side. The impact of these larger rounds was particularly terrifying as they created craters in the masonry and sent lethal shards of stone flying through the interior. The enforcers felt like they were being dismantled by 1,000 small bites, their defense slowly being eroded by the sheer volume of metal being directed at them. The physical sensation of the sub-zero cold inside the brick building was a constant debilitating weight. Without the movement of the initial raid, the men's core temperatures began to drop, leading to uncontrollable shivering that made accurate shooting impossible. Their ears and noses had turned a pale, waxy white, the first signs of the flesh beginning to die from the frost. They had no way to build a fire without exposing their position or consuming the oxygen in the cramped rooms. The cold was a silent enemy that worked in tandem with the mob, draining the enforcers' energy and slowing their reflexes. They lived in a world of blue shadows and white breath where every movement required a conscious effort of will. On the far side of the room, Ed Brooks drifted in and out of consciousness, his face gray, his jaw clenched so hard his teeth squeaked. No one spoke about whether he would make it because saying it out loud felt like tempting fate, and no one in that room had enough luck left to spare. The scale of the fight was solidified by the number of men now visible on the horizon as settlers from the surrounding 5 miles continued to pour into Cimarron. The mob had established a secondary perimeter around the town, ensuring that no reinforcements from Ingalls or Dodge City could break through. They had also cut the telegraph wires, isolating the town from the rest of the state. The enforcers were aware of this isolation, as they had attempted to send a messenger through a back alley, only to see him driven back by a wall of buckshot. They were 12 men in a sea of thousands of acres of frozen prairie, their existence reduced to the space between 4 brick walls. The physical labor of the defense was a relentless cycle of bracing doors and moving crates. Every time the battering ram struck the front of the building, the enforcers had to rush to the point of impact to prevent the wood from splintering. They used their shoulders to push against the heavy timbers, feeling the shock of the iron blow through their entire skeletons. The skin on their hands was torn and bleeding from the rough wood and the cold metal, but they could not stop. The brute force of the Cimarron mob was a mechanical process, a steady application of weight and momentum that was slowly but surely winning the struggle. The enforcers were no longer gunmen. They were laborers in a fight for their own lives. By 11 o'clock, the ammunition count for the Dodge City men had reached a critical level. Masterson ordered his men to fire only at confirmed targets, a move that allowed the mob to move closer to the building. The Cimarron men began to use long poles to push bundles of burning hay against the lower windows, hoping to set the interior woodwork on fire. The smell of burning grass and pine smoke began to fill the Bliss building, creating a hazy, suffocating atmosphere that stung the men's eyes and made them cough. They used their coats to beat back the flames that licked through the gaps in the boards, their faces scorched by the heat even as their backs remained frozen by the winter air. The brutality of the mob was reflected in their refusal to allow the removal of the wounded. When Masterson attempted to signal for a brief truce to move a man who had been struck in the thigh by a rifle slug, the mob responded with a concentrated volley that shattered the window frame and drove the enforcers back into the shadows. The injured mercenary lay on the floor, his leg tied with a belt that had been cinched so tight it cut into his skin. He groaned with every breath, his face a pale mask of agony in the dim light. The enforcers could do nothing but watch as his life's blood slowly seeped into the thirsty wood of the floorboards. The technology of communication remained the primary hope for the enforcers, as they knew that the sound of the gunfight would eventually reach the ears of the county sheriff or the state militia. However, the distance to the nearest settlement was too great for a rapid response. They were relying on the sheer relentlessness of their defense to buy them enough time for the world to notice their plight. They watched the clock on the wall, its steady ticking a counterpoint to the chaotic roar of the rifles outside. Every hour that passed was a victory. But it was a victory that came at a staggering physical and psychological cost. The internal hierarchy of the enforcers remained intact under the leadership of Jim Masterson and Bill Tillman. They moved among their men, providing ammunition and instructions with a calm, professional demeanor that masked their own desperation. They knew that if the group fractured, they would all be dead within minutes. They enforced a strict discipline, preventing the men from wasting shots or engaging in pointless dialogue with the mob. The enforcers were a single unit, a collective organism that was focused on the singular goal of survival. This professional cohesion was the only thing that kept them from being overwhelmed by the sheer mass of the Cimarron citizens. The physical sensation of the afternoon was one of a darkening, heavy cold as clouds began to obscure the sun. The light in the Bliss building faded to a dull gray, making it difficult to see the sights on the rifles. The enforcers had to rely on their ears to track the movement of the mob, listening for the crunch of boots on the snow or the clank of the battering ram. The silence between the volleys was more terrifying than the noise, as it allowed the men to think about their situation. They thought about the gold they had been promised and the families they had left in Dodge City. the human elements of their lives clashing with the gritty reality of the siege. The brick fortress was becoming a tomb, its walls a barrier that protected the enforcers but also ensured their capture. They had no food, and their physical strength was failing. One of the men, a younger mercenary named Silas, had begun to weep silently, the tears freezing on his cheeks. He did not stop firing his revolver, but his movements were jerky and imprecise. The psychological trauma of the 5-hour siege was beginning to break the will of the less experienced men. Masterson saw this and moved to Silas's side, placing a heavy gloved hand on the young man's shoulder. The contact was brief and devoid of emotion, but it was enough to keep the boy in the fight for another hour. The brutality of the environment was displayed in the way the wind carried the sound of the mob's laughter. The townspeople were treating the siege as a public event, with women and children watching from the safety of the distant buildings. They had brought out stoves and were cooking food in the street, the scent of frying bacon drifting into the Bliss building to mock the hungry men inside. The enforcers were being treated like cornered animals, a spectacle for the entertainment of the county. This realization added a layer of bitter resentment to their struggle, making them even more determined to kill as many of the mob as possible before they were taken. The scale of the fight reached its peak at noon, when the Cimarron marshal finally managed to impose a temporary ceasefire. The silence that followed was heavy and ringing, a physical pressure that made the men's ears ache. The marshal stood in the center of the street, his hands raised, and shouted for Masterson to come to the window. He stated that the mob was preparing to use dynamite to breach the walls, and that there would be no survivors if the building was taken by force. He offered a final chance for surrender, stating that the enforcers would be protected from the mob if they laid down their weapons and walked out into the street. They looked at Brooks and then away, because there was nothing more to do for him without lowering their guard. The blood on his clothes had begun to stiffen, turning fabric into crust, and even the men who prided themselves on hardness could not pretend it was a clean thing to watch. The marshal refused this condition, demanding total and immediate disarmament. The mob behind him began to shout for the dynamite to be brought forward. The tension of the moment was a physical weight that pressed down on everyone in the street. Masterson realized that he had no leverage left. He ordered his men to unload their rifles and revolvers and to place the weapons on the floor in the center of the room. One by one, the enforcers complied, the sound of the metal hitting the wood a final echoing tally of their defeat. They gathered their wounded and prepared to walk out of the brick fortress they had defended for 6 brutal hours. The physical sensation of walking out of the building was one of overwhelming vulnerability. The enforcers stepped into the blinding light of the snow-covered street, their hands on their heads. They were met by a wall of rifles and the silent, hateful stares of the 300 men they had been shooting at all morning. The air was even colder than they had imagined, and the wind bit into their scorched faces with a new intensity. They were led through the mob toward the center of town, their boots crunching on the thousands of brass shell casings that littered the road. The brutality of the crowd was palpable as several men reached out to strike the prisoners with rifle butts or fists. The injuries of the day were now visible in the clear light of the afternoon. 2 of the enforcers were being carried by their comrades, their blood dripping onto the snow in a trail of dark red spots. One of the Cimarron men had been shot in the eye, the socket a hollow, bloody ruin that he covered with a dirty hand. Another had been struck in the jaw, the bone hanging at a grotesque angle. The total number of casualties for the day reached 21, with 4 men dead and 17 wounded. The scale of the violence was unprecedented for a town of 500 people, a fact that would soon make Gray County a name synonymous with frontier brutality. The brick building stood behind them, a pockmarked and shattered shell of its former self. It was a monument to the violence of the morning, its walls stained with blood and smoke. The enforcers were gone, the safe was unmoved, and the records remained in Cimarron. The rivalry had reached its peak of physical violence, but the resolution was as far away as ever. The men were led into the local jail, a small stone building that offered a different kind of confinement. They were locked in the narrow cells, their bodies finally beginning to collapse from the exhaustion and the cold. The grit of the situation was found in the way the jailer treated the prisoners. He did not provide blankets or water, instead spending his time sharpening a hemp rope in the hallway where the men could see him. The threat of a lynching remained a constant presence, a dark shadow that hung over the cells. The enforcers sat in the dark, their thoughts a chaotic mixture of the morning's violence and the uncertainty of the night to come. They were the remnants of a professional force that had been broken by the raw, disorganized fury of a frontier town. The historical reality of the day was written in the scars on the brickwork and the blood on the snow. It was a day of brute force and relentless ambition, where the value of a human life was measured against the location of a courthouse. The people of Cimarron had defended their town, but they had also unleashed a level of violence that would change the character of the community forever. The rivalry was no longer a political dispute. It was a blood feud that would be passed down through the generations, a permanent mark on the history of the High Plains. As the sun began to set on the evening of January 12th, a heavy silence returned to Gray County. The wind died down and the temperature began to drop even further, reaching 15 degrees below zero. The town of Cimarron was an armed camp, with guards stationed at every window and a new perimeter established around the courthouse. The safe sat in the dark, its iron skin a cold and indifferent witness to the events of the day. The records inside remained a collection of names and numbers, a paper heart that had brought a storm of fire and lead to the plains. The battle was no longer just an argument about paper and ink. It had taken a life in the street. J.W. English lay dead, and it had left men like Brooks bleeding on the floor, proof that the county seat war had finally crossed the line it had been circling for 2 years. January 13th, 1889. The sun ascended over a landscape defined by wreckage and deep frost, illuminating the dark, frozen puddles of blood that marked the path of the previous day's conflict. The temperature at 7 o'clock in the morning was exactly 12 degrees below zero, causing the very air to feel like a physical weight against the chest of any man emerging from his home. Cimarron had transformed from a hopeful prairie town into a collection of pockmarked wooden and stone shells. The silence of the morning was absolute, devoid of the usual sounds of hammers or lowing cattle, replaced only by the rhythmic crunch of boots on the thousands of brass shell casings littering the dirt. Men moved through the streets with their collars turned up, their eyes fixed on the frozen ruts of the road where the iron wheels of the wagons had carved jagged lines into the earth. The Bliss building stood as a shattered skeleton of its former self, its brickwork scarred by hundreds of impact points from high-velocity projectiles. The mortar between the bricks had been pulverized into a fine reddish dust that coated the boardwalks like a layer of dry silt. Inside the structure, the smell of cordite and burnt wood was still thick, clinging to the wool coats of the men who entered to survey the interior. Shards of glass from the second-story windows lay in sparkling heaps on the floorboards, reflecting the cold morning light in erratic, blinding patterns. The wooden staircase was a ruin of splinters and jagged edges where the howitzer blast had struck, making the upper floor inaccessible without the use of a ladder. In the back of the local furniture store, the body of J.W. English lay on a wooden workbench, his skin a waxy gray color that matched the winter sky. He was the one confirmed death of the fight, a Cimarron man who had stepped into the gunfire and never stepped back. The townspeople moved around him with careful, quiet respect, as if loud voices might somehow summon the shooting again. The physical reality of the wounded in the bank was a study in gritty endurance and primitive care. 14 men occupied the floor, their bodies wrapped in dirty quilts and their wounds treated with nothing more than raw whiskey and carbolic acid. One defender, struck in the shoulder by a .30 caliber slug, lay staring at the ceiling, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. The barber, acting as a surgeon, used a pair of fine-nosed pliers to extract a piece of wool cloth that the projectile had driven deep into the man's muscle. The sound of the metal scraping against bone was audible to everyone in the room, a sharp clicking noise that caused the other patients to turn their heads away. Outside, the task of removing the dead horses required the combined strength of 10 men and a team of oxen. The 5 animals lay in a tangled heap of harness leather and frozen flesh near the loading dock of the courthouse. Their bodies were so cold they had become as rigid as stone, making it impossible to undo the buckles of the heavy leather straps. The men were forced to use axes to chop through the frozen harnesses, the sharp blades biting into the wood and leather with rhythmic thuds. They hauled the carcasses toward the river, the weight of the animals causing the sleds to groan and the oxen to strain against their yokes. The dark red frost left behind in the snow marked the path of the extraction, a grim tally of the day's mechanical losses. The Cimarron jail, constructed of thick limestone blocks, provided a freezing confinement for the 12 Dodge City enforcers. They were squeezed into 2 small cells, their sheepskin coats stained with the red dust of the Bliss building and the dark spots of dried blood. Jim Masterson sat in the corner of his cell, his eyes fixed on the narrow sliver of light coming from the hallway. He did not speak to the guards, who stood outside the iron bars with their double-barreled shotguns. The prisoners were offered no fire and no hot food, their sustenance consisting of hard biscuits and cold water that had begun to film over with ice. The threat of a mob remained a constant vibrating presence, as groups of armed citizens frequently gathered in the street outside, their voices low and menacing. The merchants of the town spent the morning assessing the destruction of their inventories. The hardware store had been emptied of its entire supply of ammunition, totaling exactly 4,000 rounds, all of which had been distributed to the militia without payment. The general store's stock of heavy lumber and scrap iron had been consumed by the construction of the barricades. These men looked at their empty shelves, realizing that the survival of their town had come at the cost of their personal wealth. The financial scale of the wreckage was estimated at exactly $5,200, a sum that represented the collective savings of the community. There was no insurance and no expectation of state reimbursement from the governor. Paranoia defined the movement of every citizen in the town limits. Guards occupied the rooftops of every building higher than a single story, their rifles resting on sandbags and their eyes scanning the western horizon. They watched for any sign of a dust cloud or a glint of sunlight off a rifle barrel that might indicate a second raid from Ingalls. Every stranger who approached on the road was met with a wall of leveled barrels and a demand for identification. The isolation of the high plains was a physical weight, as the telegraph lines remained dead and the railroad tracks were buried under a fresh layer of drifting snow. Cimarron was a fortress in a white void, entirely dependent on its own strength to survive the night. The treatment of a man named George Miller provided a vivid example of the brutality of frontier injuries. A projectile had struck him in the forearm, shattering both the radius and the ulna before exiting through his palm. The barber determined that the limb could not be saved and prepared for an amputation at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. They used a common meat saw, sharpened on a whetstone and a bottle of high-proof rye. 2 men held Miller down on a kitchen table while the saw cut through the flesh and bone, the sound a wet, rasping noise that filled the small space. They cauterized the stump with a hot iron from the blacksmith's forge, the scent of burning flesh lingering in the air for hours. The tally of the ammunition shells collected from the street reached a total of 3,422 by noon. The marshal's deputies stored them in wooden buckets, the brass cylinders clinking together with a metallic ring. This number solidified the intensity of the fight in the minds of the local government officials. They noted that the majority of the shells were found in the 2-block radius around the courthouse and the Bliss building. The density of the fire had been so great that some of the wooden telegraph poles were nearly severed by the repeated impacts of the slugs. The men studied the patterns of the shells, identifying the positions of the Dodge City gunmen by the neat, disciplined piles they had left behind. Families in the town were struggling with the psychological toll of the mobilization. Women who had spent the previous day huddling in damp cellars now worked to feed the hundreds of armed men who patrolled the streets. They baked bread and boiled large pots of salt pork, the heat from the stoves providing the only relief from the sub-zero air. Children were kept away from the windows, their play quiet and fearful as they mimicked the actions of the guards. The social order of the town had been replaced by a military hierarchy, where the only thing that gave a man status was his proficiency with a firearm and his willingness to stand on the perimeter in the freezing dark. Outside, a single grave was dug in the hard, frozen ground. The men who swung the shovels did it in silence, taking turns when their hands went numb. J.W. English would be laid beneath the winter soil, and the town would remember him as the price that had been paid, when paper finally turned into bullets. The technology of the railroad remained a mocking presence in the town. The tracks of the Santa Fe ran within 50 yards of the courthouse, a cold iron reminder of the speed with which the Dodge City enforcers had arrived. The townspeople viewed the rails with a new sense of distrust, seeing them as a conduit for the ambitions of wealthy men in the East. They discussed the possibility of tearing up a section of the track to prevent another train from reaching the station, but the fear of railroad retaliation kept them from acting. The railroad had brought the industrial age to the plains, but it had also brought the professionalization of violence through the hired enforcers. Inside the courthouse, the county clerk attempted to organize the official records among the debris. The iron safe remained in the center of the room, its black surface pockmarked with gray streaks where projectiles had ricocheted off its skin. The office was freezing as the wind pushed through the hundreds of holes in the wooden siding. The clerk's hands were bandaged with strips of white cotton, his fingers stiff as he sorted through the papers that had been scattered during the struggle. He found several land deeds that had been stained with blood, the fluid now a dark, dry crust on the parchment. The safe was the only object in the room that had not been damaged, a silent witness to the carnage. Rumors from the west began to reach the town via riders who had bypassed the main roads. They reported that Asa Sol was claiming the records had been successfully stolen and that Cimarron was a smoking ruin. This misinformation was intended to demoralize the local supporters and encourage the outlying farmers to switch their allegiance to Ingalls. The Cimarron marshal responded by sending his own messengers out with a tally of the captured prisoners and the news that the records were still secure. This war of information was as relentless as the physical combat, with both sides using every means available to control the local perception of the conflict in Gray County. The environment of the evening was a study in deepening lethal cold. As the sun began to set at precisely 4:30 in the afternoon, the temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero. The moisture in the men's nostrils froze instantly, and the skin on their cheeks felt as if it were being scraped by a razor. The guards on the barricades were forced to rotate every 15 minutes to prevent their limbs from freezing. They stood in the dark, their rifles tucked inside their coats to keep the oil from thickening and jamming the mechanisms. The town was a landscape of long blue shadows and white breath, a silent fortress waiting for a second attack from the mercenaries of Ingalls. The prisoners in the jail were suffering from the effects of the extreme temperature. One of the enforcers had a foot that had turned a dark, waxy black from frostbite, the tissue dead and beginning to emit a sickly odor. The jailer refused to provide a doctor, telling the man that he would be lucky to keep his life, let alone his toes. The psychological pressure on the Dodge City men was a deliberate part of the Cimarron strategy. They wanted the mercenaries to believe that their employer had abandoned them, hoping that one of them would provide testimony against the Ingalls leadership. The enforcers sat in the dark, their thoughts focused on the possibility of a lynching by the mob outside. The absence of any intervention from the state government was a source of growing anger among the citizens. The telegraph lines remained broken, and the distance to the capital in Topeka felt insurmountable. The people realized they were entirely on their own, living in a world where the only law was the one they could enforce with a shotgun or a rifle. This vacuum of authority was being filled by the raw power of the town's rivals, a force as cold and unrelenting as the Kansas wind. They felt like they had been forgotten by the world, left to settle their disputes with metal and fire in the middle of a frozen wasteland. The cost of the ammunition used in the defense was calculated at exactly $172, a figure that represented the total savings of several families. The Cimarron men had used their own money to buy the projectiles that had saved the records, a sacrifice that was now being felt in the lack of food and coal in their homes. The economy of the town had shifted entirely to the requirements of combat, with every resource being directed toward the maintenance of the perimeter. This financial depletion was a necessary part of the struggle, a price the people were willing to pay to prevent their town from disappearing from the map of the High Plains. The leadership of the town had undergone a permanent shift toward militancy. The men who had been the most aggressive during the street fight were now the ones making the decisions for the community. The voice of moderation had been silenced by the roar of the rifles. The town was now governed by a council of defense, a group of men whose primary qualification was their willingness to kill to protect the courthouse safe. This radicalization of the populace was a lasting consequence of the seat war, changing the character of the settlement forever. They were no longer farmers and shopkeepers. They were soldiers in a blood feud that showed no sign of ending. By nightfall, the real count had settled into everyone's bones. One man, J.W. English, was dead. Several others were wounded, some lightly, some badly, and the rest walked around with the shaken, hollow look of people who had survived something they did not fully understand. It was enough to stain Cimarron forever. Infrastructure damage was visible in the dozens of bullet-riddled water barrels found along the main thoroughfare. The wood had been punctured so many times that the barrels could no longer hold water, their staves splintered and their iron hoops bent. This loss of stored water was a critical problem for a town that relied on barrels for fire protection. The townspeople were forced to haul water from the frozen river, breaking the ice with sledgehammers and carrying the heavy pails up the steep banks. The physical effort of this task added to the exhaustion of the population, a constant reminder of the fragility of their existence in a town under constant threat. The hatred within the community was a palpable, vibrating force. As the men sat around their stoves in the evening, they did not speak of peace or compromise. They spoke of the next raid, of the vengeance they would exact on the people of Ingalls, and of the ways they would destroy the career of Asa Soul. The conflict had moved beyond the location of the county seat. It had become a personal struggle for survival and retribution. They viewed their rivals as a different species, a group that had forfeited their right to live on the plains by hiring professional assassins to kill their neighbors in the dark of the morning. A single telegraph message was finally sent to Dodge City late in the evening when a repair crew managed to bridge a gap in the wires. The operator reported the names of the dead and the fact that the enforcers were being held in the limestone jail. This news would soon trigger a wave of legal reactions that would move the conflict into its next phase. The wires hummed with the information, a thin thread of connection to a world that was just beginning to understand the scale of the violence in Gray County. The message was a signal that the isolation of Cimarron was ending. But the tension remained as high as the wind. The physical sensation of the night was one of a deep silence, occasionally broken by the loud cracking of the ice on the Arkansas River. The sound was like a rifle report, causing the guards on the rooftops to jump and level their weapons at the darkness. They lived in a state of sensory overload, their ears tuned to every snapping twig and their eyes to every movement in the shadows. The trauma of the morning incursion was a permanent filter through which they viewed the world. They would never again feel secure in their own homes, and they would never again look at their neighbors without suspicion in their hearts. Damage to the local church was documented by the deacon, who found that the building had been used as a secondary firing position. The stained glass windows had been shattered by the vibrations of the gunfire, and the pews had been moved to the doors to act as barricades. The altar was covered in a layer of gray dust and empty brass casings, a stark illustration of the way the conflict had violated every aspect of the town's life. The preacher had been among those who grabbed a rifle, his sermons now replaced by the tactical instructions of the defense. The spiritual heart of the town had been replaced by the mechanics of the struggle for the safe. The stoicism of the survivors was a requirement of their environment. They did not ask for sympathy or complain about the cold, instead focusing on the tasks that needed to be completed. A man with a bandaged hand would still swing an axe to clear the road, and a man with a limp would still stand his turn on the rooftop. This hardness was what allowed them to endure the winter and the violence. They were a community of survivors shaped by the wind and the grit of the plains. The tally of the day was a count of their endurance, a measure of their willingness to suffer for the things they possessed and the records they guarded. At exactly 10 o'clock at night, the town was finally quiet. The fires over the graves had died down to glowing embers, leaving 3 dark spots in the white cemetery. The wounded in the bank were sleeping the fitful sleep of the drugged and the exhausted, their breathing shallow in the freezing air. The prisoners in the jail were huddled together for warmth, their futures as uncertain as the next storm blowing in from the north. The iron safe in the courthouse remained in the shadows, its surface cold and indifferent. The records were still there, but the price of their presence was a town of broken buildings and hardened men who had seen too much. The scale of the rivalry had been proven by the events of the day, showing that neither side would back down regardless of the human cost. The Ingalls faction had lost its professional enforcers, and the Cimarron faction had lost its peace. The tally of January 13th was a record of a tragedy that was still unfolding, a story of pride written in the blood on the snow. The high plains were silent, the vast expanse of ice swallowing the memories of the men who had died for a metal safe. The tally was complete for the day, but the count of the struggle was still running in the hearts of the people who waited for the next shot. The final paragraph of the day's history was written in the breath of the guards on the perimeter. They stood in the sub-zero air, their eyes fixed on the western horizon where the lights of Ingalls flickered in the dark like distant predatory eyes. They knew the war was not over, and they knew the next tally would likely be even higher. They were ready for whatever came next, their hearts as cold as the metal of their rifles and their resolve as hard as the frozen ground of the cemetery. The frozen tally was a pause in the violence, a moment of reflection before the storm of the seat war continued to blow across the high plains of Kansas. By the time dawn broke over the prairie, the county seat war had already proven it could kill. Now it faced something it could not outshoot, the arrival of the state's disciplined force. General Myers did not wait for a formal greeting from the local authorities, instead ordering his men to form ranks in the middle of the thoroughfare. The rhythmic thud of 200 leather boots hitting the frozen dirt created a sound that finally silenced the remaining echoes of the previous week's gunfire. The soldiers were ordered to fix their bayonets, a mechanical process that filled the air with a series of metallic clicks as the sockets were locked into place over the rifle muzzles. This display of military readiness was a physical declaration of martial law. Myers stood in the center of the street, his hand resting on the hilt of his saber, and read a proclamation from the governor that suspended all local civil authority in Gray County. His voice was a harsh bark that carried through the still freezing air, reaching the ears of the armed men huddled inside the nearby hardware store. The physical appearance of the state troops provided a stark contrast to the ragged, grit-covered settlers of the town. The soldiers' brass buttons were polished and their wool overcoats were heavy and thick, though many of the men were already shivering as the temperature sat at exactly 5 degrees above zero. They began the process of establishing a perimeter around the town, digging shallow pits in the snow for picket posts and setting up sentry lines at every intersection. The local Cimarron residents were ordered to stay indoors, their movements restricted to their own properties unless they possessed a written pass from the military commander. The town was effectively transformed into an occupied zone, with the blue-clad sentries acting as the new arbiters of order. The smell of the occupation was a combination of coal smoke from the train, wet wool, and the metallic tang of the rifles. Disarming the population became the primary task of the first afternoon. Squads of 4 soldiers each moved from house to house, pounding on the wooden doors with the butts of their rifles. They demanded the surrender of all firearms, including revolvers, shotguns, and repeating rifles. The process was cold and clinical, with the soldiers entering the kitchens and parlors of the residents to search for hidden caches. They pulled rifles from beneath floorboards and discovered revolvers hidden inside bags of flour. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a pile of confiscated weapons had grown in the center of the street, consisting of precisely 218 rifles and 312 handguns. The metal of the barrels was cold to the touch, and the wooden stocks were scratched and worn from months of use in the seat war. The interaction between the soldiers and the local Cimarron militia was characterized by a vibrating, silent hostility. Many of the local men who had spent their savings on their Winchesters and had fought to protect the courthouse viewed the confiscation as a betrayal by the state. One farmer, his hands calloused and blackened by the frost, refused to hand over his 12-gauge shotgun until a soldier pressed the tip of a bayonet against his chest. The steel point created a small indentation in the man's wool coat, a physical reminder of the power dynamic. The farmer eventually surrendered the weapon, his jaw clenched and his eyes reflecting a hard, cold anger. The soldiers took the gun and added it to the pile, marking the owner's name on a paper tag with a lead-free graphite pencil. Deployment toward the courthouse occurred at precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon. A full company of soldiers surrounded the 2-story frame building, their bayonets forming a ring of steel around the iron safe that remained in the center of the office. The soldiers occupied the upper floor, removing the remaining furniture to create clear lines of sight through the bullet-riddled windows. They reinforced the doors with sandbags and established a machine gun nest on the roof, using a Gatling gun that had been transported on the train's flatbed. The technology of the multi-barrel weapon, capable of firing 300 rounds per minute, was an overwhelming deterrent to any further raiding parties. The residents watched the black barrels of the Gatling gun rotate in the sunlight, realizing that the era of the local militia was over. The transfer of the Dodge City prisoners from the Limestone jail was the most volatile event of the day. Jim Masterson, Bill Tillman, and the other 10 enforcers were led out into the street at 3:30 in the afternoon, their hands bound with iron shackles that clinked with every step. A crowd of Cimarron citizens gathered at the edge of the military perimeter, their voices rising in a low, rhythmic growl as they caught sight of the men who had killed their neighbors. The soldiers formed a double line between the jail and the train station, their bayonets held at the horizontal to push back the mob. The physical pressure of the crowd against the line of steel was a testament to the depth of the local hatred. One woman threw a stone that struck a soldier in the helmet, but the line held firm, the bayonets remaining steady and lethal. Masterson and Tilghman moved with a slow, deliberate gait, their faces showing no emotion despite the insults being screamed at them. They were loaded into a secure boxcar, the sliding wooden door being locked and bolted from the outside. A detail of 20 soldiers with loaded Springfields occupied the adjacent car, their orders being to fire upon anyone attempting to approach the prisoner transport. The train departed for Topeka at exactly 5 o'clock, the smoke from the engine leaving a long black trail across the white prairie. The departure of the mercenaries did not end the tension in Cimarron. It only shifted the focus toward the military presence that now controlled every aspect of daily life. Logistics of the military camp required the occupation of the local hotel and the livery stable. The soldiers set up Sibley tents in the frozen dirt of the vacant lots, the white canvas appearing like a series of cones against the gray buildings. They built large communal fires to cook their rations of hardtack, salt pork, and black coffee. The smoke from the green cottonwood logs stinging their eyes and coating their uniforms in a layer of soot. The stench of the camp, a mixture of horse dung, wood smoke, and unwashed bodies, permeated the town, replacing the metallic scent of the gunfight. The soldiers spent their evenings huddled around the fires, their conversations focused on the cold and the strangeness of the local conflict. They were outsiders in a land that viewed them as an invading force. A detachment of 50 soldiers was dispatched to Ingalls at 6 o'clock in the evening to ensure that no retaliatory force was being organized by the Western faction. They traveled the 6 miles on horseback, the animals' hooves kicking up clods of frozen earth and snow. Upon reaching Ingalls, the troops established a secondary headquarters in the stone hotel funded by Asa Soul. The millionaire developer met with the commanding officer, attempting to use his influence to secure favorable treatment for his town. The officer, a career soldier with no interest in patent medicine or irrigation canals, refused to speak with Soul, instead ordering his men to begin a systematic search for weapons in the Ingalls warehouses. The neutrality of the military was a shock to the Ingalls leadership, who had assumed their wealth would buy them protection. The soldiers patrolled the road between the two towns with a constant mechanical regularity. Every hour, a squad of cavalry rode the length of the tracks, their sabers clattering against their thighs and their carbines held across their saddles. This presence was intended to prevent any communication or movement between the rival factions. The high plains were silent, the only sound being the rhythmic thumping of the horses' hooves and the whistling of the wind. The soldiers were tasked with stopping any rider and inspecting their saddlebags for hidden messages or ammunition. They lived in a state of high alert, their eyes scanning the flat horizon for any sign of movement. The physical exhaustion of the patrols was evident in the way the men slumped in their saddles as they returned to the Cimarron camp. Physical injuries among the occupying troops began to mount within the first 48 hours. The extreme cold of mid-January was an unrelenting enemy that the soldiers' wool uniforms could not entirely defeat. Dozens of men developed chilblains on their fingers and toes, the skin turning a deep, angry purple before blistering. The military surgeon established a hospital in the local church, where he treated the men with dressings of petroleum jelly and wool wraps. One young private from Hutchinson had to have 2 toes removed after they turned black from frostbite, the surgeon using a pair of bone nippers and a small amount of ether to perform the procedure. The soldiers' suffering was a silent tally of the environmental brutality of Gray County. The lack of fresh food for the troops became a significant logistical hurdle by the 17th of January. The local merchants refused to sell their remaining stocks of grain and meat to the military, forcing the quartermaster to rely on shipments coming from the east via the railroad. This created a situation where the soldiers were better fed than the local population, who were struggling with the economic depletion caused by the war. The soldiers ate their meals in full view of the hungry townspeople, a sight that further fueled the resentment toward the occupation. The grit of the situation was found in the way the children of Cimarron stood at the edge of the camp, watching the soldiers discard the remnants of their hardtack into the snow. Disarming the special deputies who lived on the outlying farms required the military to conduct wide-ranging sweeps of the surrounding countryside. They moved in columns of 20 men, visiting every sod house and dugout within a 10-mile radius of the river. The farmers were ordered to bring their weapons to the center of their yards, where the soldiers would inspect the chambers and add the serial numbers to a government registry. The shame felt by these men was palpable. They were being stripped of their primary tools for protection and hunting by a group of city-reared boys in blue coats. The soldiers ignored the protests, focusing instead on the mechanical task of gathering the metal and wood that had fueled the seat war. The technology of the military was superior to anything held by the local partisans. In addition to the Gatling gun and the Springfield rifles, the troops brought with them field telegraph sets that allowed for immediate communication between the Cimarron and Ingalls headquarters. They strung temporary wires along the hitching posts and fence lines, creating a network that the locals could not intercept. This allowed the military to coordinate their movements with a precision that made the previous civilian raids look disorganized and primitive. The use of industrial-age communication to enforce a state-mandated peace was a turning point in the history of the county. The era of the isolated frontier town was ending, replaced by the integrated systems of the state government. Environmental details continued to dominate the experience of the occupation. A fresh blizzard struck the region on the night of the 18th, burying the Sibley tents under 3 feet of drifting snow. The soldiers were forced to spend the night shoveling to keep the tent poles from snapping under the weight. The wind roared through the streets of Cimarron at 40 miles per hour, tearing away the temporary telegraph wires and knocking over the stacks of confiscated weapons. The men on sentry duty were replaced every 10 minutes to prevent them from freezing in their tracks. The brutality of the weather was a reminder that the high plains remained the ultimate authority in the region, indifferent to the uniforms or the ambitions of the men who occupied them. The visual of the bayonet piece was most evident during the daily formation in the town square. Every morning at 6 o'clock, the troops would line up in a hollow square, their bayonets held at a steep angle as they saluted the flag. The steel blades reflected the early light, creating a wall of flickering metal that separated the town into 2 distinct halves. This display was a psychological weapon, intended to remind the citizens that any resistance would be met with immediate and overwhelming force. The bayonets were not just tools. They were the physical manifestation of the state's will. The people of Cimarron watched the formation in silence, their breaths forming a single collective cloud that hung over the street. The search for hidden caches of dynamite became a priority after a rumor circulated that the Ingalls faction had buried several crates of explosives near the railroad bridge. The soldiers used long iron rods to probe the snow and the soft dirt near the riverbank, their movements slow and careful. They eventually discovered a single wooden crate hidden inside a rotted haystack, containing 20 sticks of highly unstable dynamite and a coil of fuse. The military engineer took the explosives to a safe distance and detonated them, the sound of the blast echoing through the town and causing the glass in the remaining windows to rattle. The explosion served as a final warning to the rivals. The military would find and destroy any weapon used to continue the struggle. Curfew enforcement began at sunset, which occurred at approximately 4:45 in the afternoon. Any citizen found in the street after this time was subject to immediate arrest and detention in the military camp. The town became a landscape of dark windows and silent streets, broken only by the rhythmic pacing of the sentries and the occasional challenge of a password. The silence was absolute, a heavy, airless weight that pressed down on the residents. They lived in a world of whispers, afraid that any loud noise would draw the attention of the guards. The nights were long and freezing, with the only light coming from the glowing embers of the soldiers' campfires. Feeding the army became an economic burden on the state, with the daily cost of the occupation exceeding $400. This sum covered the transport of supplies, the salaries of the men, and the maintenance of the horses. The governor in Topeka was under constant pressure to withdraw the troops, but he realized that a premature exit would result in a second, more lethal massacre. He insisted that the troops remain until the legal status of the county seat was clarified by the state Supreme Court. This meant that the people of Gray County were living in a state of suspended animation, their lives held in place by the presence of the bayonets and the Gatling gun. Tension between state law and local pride reached a peak when the military commander ordered the removal of the county seal from the Cimarron courthouse for safekeeping. A crowd of nearly 100 men gathered at the doors, their faces contorted with rage as they watched the soldiers carry the small iron press toward the train station. The seal was the physical proof of Cimarron's status as the county seat, and its removal was viewed as a symbolic theft. The soldiers were forced to use the butts of their rifles to push back the crowd, the sound of wood hitting flesh being the only noise in the street. The seal was loaded onto a secure car and transported to Topeka, leaving Cimarron as a town without an official heart. The stabilization of the county government under military watch was a sterile, mechanical process. The commissioners were allowed to meet once a week, but their sessions were presided over by a military officer who held the power of veto over any decision. There was no discussion of new taxes or infrastructure projects. The meetings were limited to the basic requirements of public health and safety. The political life of the county had been hollowed out, replaced by the administrative requirements of the occupation. The men who had fought so hard for control now found themselves with no power at all, their ambitions neutralized by the presence of the blue uniforms. The final transport of the local wounded to larger hospitals in the east occurred on the 22nd of January. A special train equipped with hospital cots and medical supplies arrived in Cimarron to collect the men who had been injured during the siege. The process of loading the stretchers onto the cars was a somber, silent affair. The families of the wounded stood on the platform, their faces etched with grief as they watched their husbands and sons being taken away. Many of these men would never return to the high plains, their injuries leaving them permanently disabled. The train pulled away from the station at noon, the rhythmic clanking of the wheels a funeral march for the victims of the seat war. The occupation's first phase concluded with the establishment of a permanent barracks in the Bliss building. The soldiers replaced the broken windows with thick wooden planks and installed a large stove in the center of the main room. They lived among the pockmarked walls and the bloodstains, a constant reminder of the violence they were there to prevent. The building was no longer a symbol of local business. It was a fortress of the state. The soldiers spent their time playing cards and cleaning their rifles, their presence a dull, aching weight on the community. They were the humanized elements of a peace that was enforced by lead and steel. The economic impact of the occupation continued to worsen as the winter deepened. With the men of the county unable to work their land or engage in trade, the local economy ground to a complete halt. The banks were closed and the general stores were empty. The people survived on the meager supplies they had stockpiled before the war, their diets consisting of little more than cornmeal and dried beans. The desperation of the population was a physical force, a sense of hopelessness that was as cold as the wind. They were trapped in a conflict they could no longer control, their destiny in the hands of the men in Topeka. The scale of the fight was now a matter of national record, with newspapers in New York and Chicago carrying detailed accounts of the bayonet piece in Kansas. The images of the Gatling gun in the streets of a prairie town shocked the public, illustrating the extreme lengths to which the rivals would go to win. Gray County became a symbol of the lawlessness of the West, a place where the thin veneer of civilization had been shredded by greed and local pride. This reputation would haunt the region for decades, discouraging investment and slowing the growth of the communities. The rivalry had won nothing but a legacy of blood and a military occupation. As the sun set on the final day of the first week of occupation, a cold iron silence returned to the high plains. The sentries stood at their posts, their blue coats covered in a layer of white frost and their bayonets gleaming in the moonlight. The town of Cimarron was quiet, the only sound being the distant howl of a coyote and the rhythmic breathing of the soldiers. The peace was a fragile one, held together by the threat of violence and the mechanical power of the state. The rivals were separated by a line of steel, their hatred suppressed but not extinguished. The high plains of Kansas waited in the dark, the winter wind blowing across a landscape that had been forever changed by the struggle for a metal safe. The final tally of the military occupation showed no new deaths, but the physical and psychological toll on the population was immense. The people were broken, their resources exhausted, and their pride wounded. They lived in a world of bayonets and curfews, their every move watched by the men in blue. The seat war had entered a phase of frozen neutrality, a period of waiting for a legal decision that seemed increasingly irrelevant to the reality of their lives. The morning of the 23rd would bring more of the same, the cold, the smoke, and the constant presence of the soldiers. The grit of the situation was found in the way the local men looked at their empty hands. They were no longer the masters of their own territory. They were subjects of the state, their weapons gone and their status reduced to that of occupied civilians. This loss of autonomy was the ultimate price of their violence. They had sought to win everything, but they had ended up with nothing but the bayonet piece. The story of Gray County was moving toward its legal conclusion, but the scars left by the soldiers' boots would never truly heal. The clock in the station continued to tick, marking the passage of time in a county that was now a military district. The iron safe in the courthouse remained under guard, its contents a collection of papers that had caused a storm of fire and ice. The records were secure, but the town of Cimarron was a shadow of its former self, its future as uncertain as the next blizzard. The bayonet piece was a victory for the law, but it was a tragedy for the people. The high plains remained cold and indifferent, a vast expanse of white that swallowed the echoes of the soldiers' commands. June 7, 1889. The wind still came hard across the open prairie, but the sound that mattered now was not rifle fire. It was the slow, grinding sound of law as the Kansas Supreme Court issued its decision, Bradford versus Mallow, and set down in black ink what Gray County men had already learned in blood. It was not a fresh election day, it was a judgment day. The opinion reached back to the county seat election held on October 31, 1887, and it read like a post-mortem naming bribery, intimidation, and ballot box tricks with a bluntness that left no room for polite lies. Gray County's fight was never just a feud between towns, it was a contest for the courthouse, the tax books, the land filings, and the authority that came with those papers. Cimarron's eastern faction and Ingalls' western faction had both treated the ballot like a weapon, and the court laid out how that weapon had been used. In the western precincts, the rolls had been swollen with names that did not belong there. Men who had never set foot in the county, men who had vanished months earlier, and men who existed only on paper. In the eastern precincts, voters were crowded, hurried, and watched, and the line between persuasion and threat blurred into the same hard stare. Money moved as freely as whiskey. $5 gold pieces changed hands and promises were made in back rooms and on wind-scoured streets, not whispered, but spoken with the confidence of men who believed they could buy a county. When the polls closed, the counting began under armed eyes and clenched jaws. The numbers were argued, the returns were challenged, and every disputed tally felt like a spark falling into dry grass. The court's ruling did not pretend this was ordinary politics. It described the affair as a county seat fight in its ugliest form, and it made clear that the election that started the war had been poisoned at the source. Yet even with the law, speaking plainly, Gray County's peace was still fragile, held together by orders on paper and the weary knowledge of what gunfire had already done. The reaction in Cimarron was a heavy, airless silence that was more terrifying than the previous gunfire. Men walked out of the polling stations and looked at their town, realizing that the buildings they had constructed with their own hands were now worth less than the scrap wood they were made of. The social contract of the county had been permanently shredded, leaving behind a residue of bitter hatred that would not be washed away by any court ruling. The citizens gathered in small groups on the boardwalks, their voices low and their hearts hard. They discussed the possibility of a second raid, but the presence of the state troops and the exhaustion of their resources made any further violence seem like a form of collective suicide. The physical evacuation of the county records began the following morning. A group of state deputies arrived in Cimarron with 2 heavy freight wagons and a squad of cavalry. They entered the courthouse and removed the iron safe, the same safe that the Dodge City enforcers had failed to seize in January. This time there was no resistance, only the silent glares of the townspeople as the metal box was loaded onto the wagon bed. The safe was covered with a heavy canvas tarp and tied down with thick hemp ropes. As the wagons pulled away toward the west, the wheels carved deep, permanent ruts into the dirt of the main street, a physical mark of the town's loss. The scale of the exodus from Cimarron was immediate and devastating. Within 3 days of the election result, over 20 families had packed their belongings into wagons and headed east or south, seeking a new start in a place where the law held more weight. The town began to hollow out, the windows of the houses boarded up and the doors locked. The local merchants, who had invested everything in the struggle, found themselves without customers or credit. The general store, which had been a hub of activity for years, was now a silent shell, its shelves empty and its floor covered in a layer of fine dust. The loss of the county seat was not just a political event, it was a total economic collapse. The Ingalls side had no hesitation about what they were doing. They framed it as lawful authority, as the right to direct the future of the county. But the truth of it showed in the way Cimarron farmers watched water slide past their dry fields, diverted by men who were fighting for more than pride. Asa Sol's satisfaction was complete, as he now possessed the administrative control he needed to protect his $1 million investment. He walked the streets of Ingalls with the arrogance of a king, his silk hat and tailored coat a stark contrast to the rough clothing of the settlers. He had proven that on the frontier, capital was the ultimate weapon. More effective than any rifle or bayonet, he did not care about the resentment he had bred. He only cared about the dividends from his canal and the stability of his bank. To him, the struggle was a business transaction that had been brought to a successful conclusion. He viewed the hollowed-out town of Cimarron as a necessary casualty of progress. The physical sensation of the autumn in Gray County was one of a deepening, cold desolation. The days grew shorter and the wind became more biting, carrying the first hints of the coming winter snow. The landscape was a monochromatic expanse of brown and gray, reflecting the mood of the population. The people who remained in Cimarron lived in a state of suspended animation, their lives defined by the thing they had lost. They spoke of the election in hushed tones, their conversations a repetitive cycle of anger and regret. The hollow victory of Ingalls had created a divide that was as wide and deep as the Arkansas River during the spring thaw. The new courthouse in Ingalls was a two-story, stone structure that stood as a physical manifestation of the town's new status. Inside, the rooms were clean and the furniture was new, paid for with the tax revenue that was now flowing away from Cimarron. The county officials, most of whom were loyalists to the Western faction, processed the paperwork with a smug efficiency that rankled every visitor from the east. The iron safe sat in a prominent position in the main office, its black skin polished and its hinges oiled. It was no longer a target for a raid. It was a trophy of a war that had been won through corruption and influence. Resentment in the county was not limited to the town limits of Cimarron. Many of the outlying farmers who had seen their votes canceled out by the fraudulent returns from the Ingalls precincts felt a deep sense of betrayal. They realized that the democracy they had been promised on the frontier was a sham, controlled by wealthy men in far-off cities. This disillusionment led to a breakdown in local cooperation, as neighbors who had once helped each other with the harvest now refused to speak. The social fabric was replaced by a series of small, isolated islands of loyalty, each one distrustful of the other. The grit of the frontier was the realization that even in a land of vast opportunity, the old rules of power still applied. The brutality of the situation was solidified by the total lack of accountability for the voter fraud. The state government, satisfied that the violence had ended and the county seat was settled, made no effort to investigate the election returns. They viewed the result as a practical solution to a messy problem. The governor issued a statement praising the peaceful nature of the election, conveniently ignoring the gold coins and the ghost voters. This official validation of the corruption was the final blow to the morale of the Cimarron partisans. They realized that the law was not a shield for the honest man, but a tool for the powerful. The scale of the rivalry was now quantified in the loss of population and property value. The total assessed value of Cimarron dropped by exactly 65% in the 6 months following the election. Houses that had once sold for $500 were now being traded for as little as $50 or simply abandoned to the wind and the rats. The railroad station, once the busiest in the county, now saw only a few passengers a day. The trains still stopped to take on water, but the life of the town had moved 6 miles to the west. The physical decay was a visible tally of the victory's cost, a landscape of rotting wood and empty streets. The technology of the irrigation canal, which was supposed to bring prosperity to the entire county, became a source of further division. Sol's company charged exorbitant rates for the water, prices that only the largest and most loyal farmers could afford to pay. Those who had supported Cimarron found themselves unable to irrigate their crops, leading to a series of farm failures and foreclosures. The canal, a massive 96-mile-long ditch, was a physical scar across the prairie, a reminder of the power of the man who had bought the county. The water was a commodity, and like the votes, it went to the highest bidder. The environmental conditions of late 1889 were particularly harsh, with a severe drought that lasted through the entire month of October. The lack of rain made the diverted water even more critical for survival. The dry soil was picked up by the wind and blown into great clouds that covered the entire county in a layer of gray silt. The dust got into everything, the food, the water, and the lungs of the people. It seemed as if the very earth was reacting to the corruption of the election, turning the landscape into a desert of grit and wind. The people lived in a world of constant thirst and irritation, their bodies as worn as their spirits. The social hierarchy of the county was now firmly established, with the Ingalls elite at the top. These men, who had been storekeepers and laborers only 2 years prior, now acted as the lords of the plains. They occupied the best pews in the churches and the best tables in the hotels, their pockets full of souls' money. They looked down on the people of Cimarron as failures and losers, a group of men who were too weak or too honest to win the game. This arrogance fueled the lingering hatred, ensuring that the wounds of the seat war would never heal. The victory was a hollow one because it was built on a foundation of theft and betrayal. The physical sensation of living in Cimarron was one of a slow, grinding decay. The sound of the wind through the empty buildings was a constant, mournful noise that echoed through the streets. The boardwalks began to warp and rot, and the paint peeled from the storefronts in large, brittle flakes. The town was becoming a ghost of itself, a place of memories and missed opportunities. The people who stayed were the ones who had nowhere else to go, their lives tied to a piece of ground that no longer had a future. They sat on their porches and watched the trains go by, their eyes fixed on the western horizon where the lights of Ingalls flickered in the dark. The brutality of the winter that followed the election was a test of the survivors' endurance. Without the economic support of the county seat, the people of Cimarron struggled to afford coal and food. Many were forced to burn their own fences and outbuildings to stay warm, their homes shrinking as the winter progressed. The grit of the situation was the sight of a man tearing down his own barn to keep his children from freezing. They lived on a diet of salt pork and cornmeal, their health declining as the temperatures dropped below zero. The victory in the west had resulted in a landscape of starvation and cold in the east. The historical reality of the election was preserved in the private letters and diaries of the people who lived through it. They wrote of the fear and the anger, the feeling of being cheated by their own government. These documents were not the official records of the state, but the humanized accounts of a tragedy. They described the sight of the gold coins on the tables and the way the deputies looked at them with their rifles. These stories were passed down through the generations, a legacy of resentment that would define the regional politics for decades. The victory was hollow because it lacked the consent of the governed, a fact that would haunt the county long after Asa Sol was dead. The scale of the fight was now a matter of legend in Kansas, a cautionary tale of the dangers of county seat rivalries. The names of Cimarron and Ingalls were synonymous with corruption and violence, a reputation that the residents could never quite shake. They were the participants in a struggle that had gone too far, proving that the pursuit of progress could lead to the destruction of a community. The hollow victory was a reminder of the price of ambition on the frontier, a cost that was measured in lives and pride and the loss of a town's soul. The high plains remained indifferent, a vast expanse of wind and grass that eventually swallowed the wreckage of the war. As the sun set on the final day of October 1889, a heavy silence returned to the county. The wind died down, and the dust settled on the pockmarked walls of the Cimarron courthouse. The town was dark, the only light coming from the occasional flicker of a kerosene lamp in a lonely window. 6 miles to the west, the lights of Ingalls were bright and celebratory, a visual display of the new order. The rivalry had ended in a victory of capital over labor, of influence over honesty. The people of Gray County lived in the aftermath of a storm that had cleared the landscape but left behind a residue of salt and grit. The final tally of the election was recorded in the official state reports, a series of numbers that hid the reality of the fraud. The records were secure in the stone courthouse, their pages clean and their seals intact. But the people who had fought for those records were broken, their lives altered by a morning of gunfire and an afternoon of bribery. The victory was hollow because it had brought no peace, only a new form of struggle. The high plains were silent, the vast expanse of white snow ready to cover the ruts of the wagons and the graves of the dead. The hard edge of the situation showed in the way the local men looked at their empty hands. They were not gunmen. They were farmers and shopkeepers who had been forced into a role they never asked for. When the shooting started, some had fired, some had frozen, and some had run. The heroism was not in how they fought, but in the fact that they returned at all. The town itself was changed. Windows were boarded, doors were patched, and the courthouse stood like a scar in the center of Cimarron. The schoolhouse remained open, but the laughter of children sounded muffled under the weight of what had happened. The records were locked away, but Cimarron felt hollowed out, its future still uncertain beneath the same restless wind. The men who had survived were no longer the same men who had voted in the first place. On the edge of town, the widows and the wounded listened to the distant echo of wagons moving in Ingalls. They waited in the knife-cold air, staring west toward the horizon, where a few lights trembled beyond the prairie. No one spoke because there was nothing left to say. The county seat was a title on paper, but the war had carved itself into the land itself. The morning of November 1st would bring more of the same, the cold, the smoke, and the constant presence of the memory of what they had lost. The seat war was over in the eyes of the law, but in the hearts of the people it was a wound that was still bleeding. They lived in a world of winners and losers where the win was a sham and the loss was a permanent mark. The high plains of Kansas waited in the dark, the winter wind blowing across a landscape that had been forever changed by the struggle for a metal safe and the right to be the center of a world that was already passing them by. February 20th, 1893. The frost on the single-pane windows of the Ingalls courthouse formed thick, opaque patterns of white that obscured the view of the flat brown horizon. The morning was perfectly silent, lacking the energy of the boom years when the sound of hammers and the shouts of laborers filled the air. The temperature was exactly 5 degrees above zero, and the wind had died down to a low, cold hum that vibrated through the limestone walls of the administrative building. The victory of 1889 had faded into a reality of empty offices and unpaid taxes, as the residents realized that holding the records did not bring the rain or the money they needed to survive. The Santa Fe Railroad, which had once been the primary engine of the region's growth, had systematically shifted its priorities to the larger hubs in Colorado and the eastern part of the state. The trains still passed through Gray County, but the rhythmic thumping of the iron wheels was no longer a signal of arriving capital or new settlers. Instead, the locomotives carried away the families who had finally admitted defeat, leaving the depots in both Ingalls and Cimarron to rot in the sun. The station in Cimarron was boarded up at 10 o'clock in the morning, the wooden slats covered in a layer of fine gray dust that the wind had scoured from the dry riverbed. Asa Sol had died in January 1890, less than 1 year after his hard-won court victory, leaving his vast irrigation empire in a state of immediate collapse. The irrigation company that had once dug canals across the prairie now found itself drowning in debt, its pumps rusting, its ditches silting, and its contracts unraveling faster than anyone could mend them. Cimarron was in a state of physical decay that was even more visible than the decline of its rival. The storefronts along the main thoroughfare were mostly empty, their signs swinging on rusted hinges and their paint peeling in long, brittle strips. The boardwalks had warped and cracked under the intense Kansas sun, creating physical hazards for the few horses that still moved through the streets. There were precisely 12 functioning businesses left in a town that had once boasted 500 citizens. The people who remained were those who had invested their life savings in the dirt and could not afford the price of a wagon to leave the county. The population of the region had dropped by 60% since the peak of the seat war, leaving large gaps in the social fabric of the prairie. Entire blocks of houses stood empty, their doors standing open to the wind and their interior walls covered in the soot of old fires. The children who had played in the schoolyards were now teenagers, and many of them had already departed for the newly opened territories in the South. The schools operated on a skeleton schedule, with one teacher managing 3 different grade levels in a cold, airless room. The sense of Community had been replaced by a collective, quiet apathy that was as heavy as the winter frost. Drought had become the permanent state of the environment in the early 1890s, turning the once fertile soil into a fine, abrasive powder. The wind carried this grit into every crack of the wooden houses, settling on the food and the bedding and the skin of the people. It was a constant, irritating presence that turned the teeth of the settlers gray and caused a chronic hacking cough among the inhabitants. The grit of the situation was the realization that the high plains were reclaiming the land they had briefly surrendered to the plow. The desert was moving back in, and the people were too tired to fight it. The social hierarchy that had been defined by the violence of 1889 had completely disintegrated as the leaders of the factions fled or died. The men who had been called heroes for defending the courthouse were now just broke farmers standing in line for government relief. The sheriff had precisely 4 deputies left to patrol the entire county, and they spent most of their time dealing with horse theft and the scavenging of abandoned properties. There was no more talk of town pride or administrative control. The only focus was on the price of a bushel of wheat and the timing of the next snow. The technology of the irrigation canal, which was supposed to be the salvation of the region, had proven to be a mechanical failure. The steam pumps that were intended to lift the water from the Arkansas River sat rusted and motionless at the edge of the bank. The iron pipes had cracked during the sub-zero winters, and there was no money to buy the specialized parts needed for repairs. The ditch itself had become a hazard, a deep scar in the earth that trapped livestock and acted as a conduit for the dust storms. The farmers who had paid for water rights were now suing the insolvent Soule estate, their legal papers as worthless as the dry canal. The physical toll on the remaining settlers was visible in their hunched shoulders and their red, chapped hands. Poverty had become a systemic condition, with many families living on a diet of salt pork and cornmeal for months at a time. The lack of health care in the county meant that minor injuries often became permanent disabilities. An old man in Cimarron had lost 3 fingers to frostbite during the winter of 1892 because he could not afford enough coal to heat his dugout. He sat on his porch, his hand wrapped in a dirty rag, watching the horizon with a vacant expression that mirrored the desolation of the town. The courthouse safe in Ingalls remained the center of the county's official life, but the box was mostly empty of new records. There were no new land deeds being filed and very few marriages being recorded. The heavy iron door was opened only once a week by a clerk who worked for a fraction of his former salary. The safe sat in the middle of a room with cracked plaster and a leaking ceiling, its black surface covered in a layer of fine dust. It was no longer a prize worth killing for. It was a heavy, inconvenient relic of a war that everyone wanted to forget. The railroad depot at Cimarron was a study in neglect, its windows covered with scrap lumber and its platform rotting. The express trains no longer stopped there, and the mail was dropped from a moving car into a pile of dirt twice a week. The telegraph operator had long since departed for a job in Topeka, leaving the wires to hum in the wind without a key to translate their vibration. The town was cut off from the modern world, its connection to the industrial age severed by the changing priorities of the railroad executives. The iron tracks were the only thing that remained unchanged, a cold line that connected the ghost towns of the plains. The mirages on the horizon at noon were a constant reminder of the state the town had become. On hot days, the heat shimmered off the flat ground, creating the illusion of a vast lake or a bustling city where only the dry grass remained. The settlers watched these mirages with a cynical detachment, knowing that the water was not real and the buildings were just shadows. The landscape had become a place of ghosts, where the memories of the violence were more tangible than the reality of the present. They lived in a world of echoes, where the sound of a distant rifle shot was enough to make everyone stop and listen. Livestock in the county were in a state of desperate decline, with the cattle appearing as walking skeletons against the brown grass. The lack of forage and the drying of the river had led to a massive die-off during the previous summer, leaving the prairie littered with sun-bleached bones. The farmers could not afford the price of hay, and many were forced to slaughter their workhorses just to prevent them from starving to death. The smell of the county was the scent of decay, a mixture of rotting hay and the metallic tang of the alkaline soil. The animals were as much a victim of the aftermath as the humans. Insolvency had claimed the county government, with the total debt reaching exactly $14,000. The treasury was empty, and the bank in Ingalls had closed its doors in 1891 after a run on its remaining deposits. The commissioners had to meet in a private home to save on the cost of heating the courthouse. They spent their time discussing how to pay the interest on the bonds they had issued during the boom years, realizing that they would never be able to repay the principal. The county was a bankrupt entity, a legal fiction that only existed because the state had not yet dissolved it. Migration had become the only viable option for the younger generation, who left the county as soon as they reached adulthood. They packed their few possessions into small bundles and caught the freight trains heading east, looking for work in the factories or the coal mines. They did not look back at the pockmarked buildings or the dry irrigation ditches. They left behind a population of the elderly and the broken, people who were too tired to start over in a new place. The departure of the youth was the final tally of the town's failure, ensuring that there would be no one to rebuild the community when the rain finally returned. In Ingalls, the dust in the streets lay so thick it rose in choking sheets with every wagon wheel. The wind pushed it into doorways and underbeds, into ledgers, into lungs, and it gave the town the look of something half buried while still pretending to stand. Law enforcement in the county was a matter of minimal necessity, as there was very little left to steal. The Ingalls jail was mostly empty, its iron bars rusted and its stone floor covered in the droppings of owls. The marshal spent his days sitting on a bench in front of the post office, his revolver kept in a holster that had not been cleaned in years. He watched the few travelers who passed through with a mixture of suspicion and boredom. There was no more adrenaline, no more raids, and no more professional enforcers from Dodge City. The violence of 1889 was a memory of dust and silence. The saloons that had once been the centers of political intrigue were now quiet, dim rooms where the only sound was the clicking of a lone game of solitaire. The whiskey was watered down and the tobacco was stale, and there were no more crowds to shout insults at the rivals from Cimarron. The gamblers and the opportunists had moved on to the next boom town, leaving behind the local men who sat in the shadows and drank to forget the winter of the siege. The air in the saloons was stagnant and smelled of sour beer and wood smoke, a scent that clung to the men's clothes like a layer of shame. The Brick Bliss building in Cimarron, which had served as a fortress during the January raid, was now a pockmarked ruin. The holes from the rifle, projectiles, and the howitzer blast had never been repaired, and they had become homes for the local birds in the wind. The building was structurally unsound, its walls leaning at a precarious angle that threatened the safety of the boardwalk. It stood as a physical manifestation of the violence of the seat war, a reminder of the morning the gunman came to steal the safe. The people walked past it without looking, their eyes fixed on the ground as they navigated the warped planks. The Arkansas River, which had once been a wide, flowing vein of life for the county, was now a series of stagnant, muddy pools. The drought and the upstream diversions had reduced the flow to a trickle, and the water was thick with alkaline salts that made it undrinkable for humans and lethal for livestock. The stone bridge that Sol had built to connect Ingalls to the south stood over a dry bed of sand and gravel, its arches spanning nothing but a landscape of desolation. The river had abandoned the towns, and in doing so, It had taken away their last hope for a sustainable future. The local press had completely disappeared from the county by 1893. The editors of the Cimarron and the Ingalls Messenger had both fled their offices, leaving behind their heavy iron presses and their crates of type. There were no more editorials calling for blood or accusing the rivals of theft. The silence of the press was a signal of the town's decline, as there was no one left to record the mundane details of the situation. The news from the outside world arrived in the form of old papers from Topeka, which the settlers read with a sense of envy and disbelief. The transition from bitterness to apathy was the final stage of the county's social collapse. The people no longer hated their rivals with the same intensity they had in 1889. The hatred had been replaced by a shared misery, as both towns realized that they had been manipulated by men like Asa Soul for a goal that was never achievable. They were all victims of a collective delusion, a belief that the location of a courthouse could overcome the physical realities of the high plains. They looked across the 6 miles of prairie at the silhouettes of the rival town and felt nothing but a hollow, aching recognition of their shared failure. A fire broke out in the abandoned hotel in Ingalls at precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday in early February. There was no fire department to fight it, and the town's water barrels were empty. The people stood in the street and watched as the dry wood of the interior was consumed by the flames, the smoke rising in a tall black column that was visible for 20 miles. The heat from the fire caused the stone walls to crack and collapse, sending a shower of sparks into the dry grass. No one moved to stop the fire. They simply watched until the building was reduced to a pile of blackened stone and ash. The bankruptcy of the county was recorded in the state's official tally, showing that over 80% of the original homesteaders had lost their land to the banks. The grit of the situation was the sight of the eviction notices tacked to the doors of the sod houses and the dugouts. The farmers left their plows in the fields and their wagons in the barns, walking away from the dreams they had pursued for a decade. The land was being consolidated into large corporate-owned ranching tracts, a move that replaced the small farms with the vast, lonely cattle ranges of the past. The era of the pioneer was over in Gray County. The grit on the skin and the teeth was the permanent sensation of life in 1893. The people moved with a slow, heavy deliberation, their eyes perpetually narrowed against the wind. They did not speak much, as the dust made their throats sore and their voices hoarse. They lived in a world of muted colors and muffled sounds where the only thing that felt real was the cold and the hunger. They were the survivors of a war that had no winners, a group of people who had been hardened by the environment and the violence until they were as tough and indifferent as the limestone blocks of the courthouse. The shared misery of both towns was most evident during the winter months, when the fuel ran low and the temperatures dropped to 20 degrees below zero. The people of Cimarron and Ingalls huddled around their stoves, burning dried buffalo dung and corn cobs to stay warm. They did not celebrate the holidays or the anniversaries of their towns. They lived one day at a time, their thoughts narrowed down to the next meal and the next load of wood. The rivalry was a luxury they could no longer afford, a part of their past that felt like a different life. They were bound together by the ice and the wind. The auditory landscape of the wind was a constant low-frequency roar that never ceased. It whistled through the bullet holes in the walls and moaned through the empty hallways of the stone hotel. It was a sound that made it difficult to sleep and impossible to think. The wind was the physical manifestation of the prairie's power, a force that was slowly grinding the towns into the dust. The people had learned to live with the noise, their ears tuned to its rhythm, but it was a sound that eventually broke the sanity of many who stayed too long. The wind was the final arbiter of the seat war, outlasting the rifles and the gold coins. The final conclusion of the war for the county seat was the reclaiming of the land by the prairie. The fences were being buried by the blowing sand, and the irrigation ditches were filling with silt. The towns were shrinking, their footprints on the earth becoming smaller with every passing year. The situation in Gray County was not a move toward progress, but a struggle against the environment that had been lost. The high plains remained indifferent to the ambitions of the rivals, a vast expanse of white snow and brown grass that would eventually erase all trace of the courthouse and the safe. The records in the iron safe were eventually moved back to Cimarron at 12 o'clock noon on a day when the wind was particularly high. There was no parade and no celebration. A single wagon pulled up to the Ingalls courthouse, and 2 men carried the metal box out to the street. They drove the 6 miles to the east and placed the safe in the pockmarked frame building that had served as the first temporary seat. The records were home, but the home was a shadow of its former self. The move was an administrative detail that held no weight in the lives of the people. It was a hollow gesture in a county that had already seen its peak. The final paragraph was written in the silence of the snow on the evening of February 20th. The sentries were long gone, replaced by the cold blue shadows of the winter twilight. Out on the high plains, darkness settled in, and the winter wind swept across ground that would never feel the same after the fight for a metal safe. The rivalry had proven how far men would go to win, but it had also shown the devastating price of that victory. The ghostly horizon was all that remained, a line where the sky met the earth and the memories of the men who died for a box of papers faded into the wind.